هلا بتشوف
ما إلي قلب عفرق كمان.
لكن بدنا ننقلك انت وياه لكن طيب طيب well good morning, it's good to see you again. ايه دورنا لهذا ماشي. It's good to see you again. I was really pleased when it comes to the first workshop when I noticed that you really liked that workshop, and I hope that you would like this one too and find it beneficial. So, and this is actually one of the major concerns that we have, to develop workshops that are somehow useful and meaningful for the participants. And this is one of the major issues that we take into consideration when developing the material. This workshop is considered to be as a continuation of what we did last time. So it's a supplement of the material that we started last time, and it builds actually on what we did in the first part of financial accounting. So we still have this part in financial accounting, and that will be it when it comes to financial accounting. Later on, we'll have one full workshop in management accounting. And management accounting focuses mostly on budgeting, how to prepare budgets. We have different type of budgets. We have sales budget, we have production budgets, we have cash budgets, and so on. So we learn how to prepare those budgets and how to use them for decision-making purposes. كمان بالmanagement accounting, we'll be talking about costing and different type of cost systems that are used to cost a certain product or a certain service. Yani, if you are a manufacturing company, let's say, and producing certain, let's say, furniture items, what is the cost of producing this table? You have to take the cost of the material that is used. You have to take the cost of the labor that was used to produce the table, plus a certain amount of what we call overheads, electricity, cleaning, and so on and so forth. This will be the focus of the second course in accounting, which is management accounting. Most likely we'll be able to, as a بتكون, relate to management accounting more than financial accounting, لأنه many of you do budgeting, many of you do costing, and these are things that are mostly used by managers for internal decision-making purposes. But this does not mean that financial accounting is not relevant or is not directly relevant to what you do, لأنه at the same time you have still to read financial statements and make sense of the financial figures that are reported. Okay? So in this case, the purpose of this course is to supplement what we did at the introductory level when it comes to financial accounting. We'll be looking at various aspects of the financial statements, and we'll be looking a little bit more in details. We'll be looking more into the details of the financial statements. What I will do in this case, I will start by reviewing what we did last time, very briefly, just to refresh your memory. We'll talk a little bit about the different financial statements and so on, and then we'll move on with the new material. Is it fine? Sure. Any questions? Any inquiries? Time. Let us have a look let's review what we did. You know what? Let me just go over the course outline for 1 second for the course, and then we proceed. For the course outline, actually, you have this reference book, which is Williams, Hecka, Bettner, and Carcello. You have the 15th edition, in case you are interested in having a certain reference when it comes to financial accounting. That's a good book. It's easy to read. It's very systematic, and it goes on a step-by-step basis. So you can easily follow with the material, even if you don't have a background in accounting. For the material coverage, we'll be talking a little bit about financial statements. We'll be talking a little bit about receivables, how to account for receivables, how to account for inventory items for stock, how do we account for long-lived assets, the assets that are expected to last for a long period of time, like land, building, equipment, and so on, how to account for liabilities for debt, how to account for the equity section of the balance sheet, and in case we had time, we'll be looking a little bit about financial statement analysis, how to look at financial statements and how to analyze financial statements. In case we did not have time, you will have another course later on in finance that focuses on financial statement analysis in depth. Okay, so in this case, you won't be missing anything, and we will be covering this later on in your finance course. In case we had enough time, we'll be covering financial statement analysis on a very basic level. Later on, when you go to your finance course, you'll be somehow prepared to start with financial statement analysis. Okay? For the grading, we have a project for 45%. We have an examination, a final exam for 45%. And we have attendance and participation for a percentage of 10%. Okay? We'll talk about the projects later on. We can be as creative as possible. For some of you, you may say, well, I'm going to look at the financial statements of my own company. Well, in this case, related to whatever we discuss in this course. Or you may say, well, please give me some projects that you have, and I will go over that project. So we'll keep it as flexible as possible to make you as comfortable, as efficient as possible. Okay? So I won't restrict you to a specific project. But whatever projects that you will be undertaking later on, it has to be in line with the material that's covered within this workshop. Okay? We'll come to it a little bit more in details later on. Any questions? Any questions? We will agree on the exam date later on. We'll look at your schedule, بنشوف whatever is best for your schedule, and then we will schedule it accordingly. And I don't have any problem لأنه I'm around most of the time. So in this case, we'll look at your schedule and we'll see what's most convenient for you so that we can schedule the exam accordingly. It should not be a problem. Okay? And the exam should be a 1 hour, 15 minutes exam. It should not be that long. It should not be that complex, but it's not easy, of course. And it's not that complicated. It only tests whether you grasp the basic concepts that were covered throughout this workshop. Okay? Right. Any questions? Questions? Right. You should have a copy of the course outline in your folders. And if in case you have any inquiries, in case you have any questions, please let me know so that we can discuss it later on in groups or on individual basis. Questions? Questions? Right. Let's recall what we did last time when it comes to financial accounting. What did we discuss last time? What we did? Yeah. We talked a little bit about financial accounting, and we talked a little bit about financial statements. I don't like this classroom because you have to write on the board. The other one is more flexible because you have the whole wall to write on and you have more space. Right. What did we say about financial statements? How many financial statements do we have? We have 3 or 4 financial statements, including the income statement, the balance sheet, the cash flow statement or the statement of cash flows, and the statement of retained earnings. What did we say about the income statement? What does it report? What type of information do we have on the income statement? It reports the profits or loss of the company over a certain period of time or for a certain period of time. And normally we compute the amount of profit or the amount of loss by looking at the difference between the revenues and the expenses. And we explained that the revenues are mainly generated from providing a certain service or from selling a certain product to the client. So let's say if you have, a car dealership, then in this case you generate revenues from selling cars and providing after-sale service to your clients, right? So you have 2 major sources of revenues. Sales revenue related to selling cars or inventory items, and after-sale service, right? When it comes to expenses, those are expenditures that are incurred to generate revenues, to generate sales. That's correct. And normally, the revenues may be in cash or they may be on account. Now, certain clients do not pay necessarily in cash. We sell them and they have to pay later on. And the same for the expenses. Certain expenses are paid upfront, right? We get the service from a certain company or a certain, entity, and we pay upfront. In other cases, we tell them, well, give us the invoice. We will settle it later on. Okay? So simply, when it comes to the income statement, it shows us the amount of profits or the amount of loss that the company has realized over a certain period of time or for a certain period of time. What about the balance sheets? What type of information does it provide?
What we owe and what we own.
What we owe in the form of assets, and in this case, we discuss, and the liabilities, what we owe. When it comes to the assets, we have different type of assets. We have those assets that are expected to last for a relatively short period of time, اللي هي 1 year. We have other assets that are expected to be more long-term in nature, like this building, like this equipment, this desktop, this laptop, and so on and so forth. The furniture items, all these are examples of long-term assets. ليش؟ لأنه they are expected to last for more than 1 year. When it comes to the short-term assets, we call them current assets, such as, for example, cash in the bank. We expect to spend it or we expect to consume it within a relatively short period of time. Account receivable or collectibles from the clients. نحن مرات we sell to our clients on account and we have to collect later on. So we'll receive a certain amount of cash from our client later on. This is why we call it account receivable. In many cases, we have other current assets such as supplies. بيكون في عنا A4 paper, بيكون في عنا stationery items, بيكون في عنا toners for the printers. All these are called supplies. بيكون في عنا inventory items, stock. إذا كنا تنقول car dealership, في عنا a stock of cars. إذا كنا bookstore, we have a stock of books and stationery items, and so on and so forth. Right?
Sorry.
Yes.
Supplies أي سعر؟
At the purchase price, اللي هو الcost.
إذا أنت you want to liquidate يمكن ما تبيعهم.
supplies are normally purchased for internal use. يعني هون let's say at the business school we buy A4 paper لأنه we have to print certain documents and so on. We buy let's say stationery item like this pen and other stationery items to be able to use them for operating purposes. Okay? So we record them normally at cost. في عنا other type of assets such as investments. إذا كنا for example we purchase certain number of shares in Solidar, in Microsoft, in Citibank, in Audi Bank, and so on. These are investments that we already undertake in the form of acquisition of shares in other companies or other entities. So in this case, when it comes to what we own or the assets, we have two different group of assets. The first one is the current and the second one is the long term. The same apply for the liabilities. We may have current liabilities, which are amounts that we have to settle within a short period of time, which is relatively one year. And we have also long-term liabilities. Example of current liabilities include accounts payable to suppliers. Nahla, when we buy goods from the supplier, we may not pay in cash immediately. We may buy on account. And normally we have a limited period of time, اللي هن between 30 and 90 days بيعطونا credit facility, right? And in this case, it's very important that we take advantage of this option. لأنه in this case, we are having free financing. We are buying goods on account without having to pay any interest. ما بيدفعونا interest على payables when it comes to the suppliers, right? But in this case, we have to be very careful to make sure that we pay on time. Else, they won't accept to sell us on credit later on. Now, come on.
Paid advance for the price of the cars before they sell them.
يلا هلا بنحكي بصير في عندك شيء asset اسمه prepayment.
صارت asset.
Yes, in this case we have a prepayment. Like in the case of, let's say, prepaid rent. Like in the case of prepaid rent, like in the case of insurance. You buy the insurance policy today, but the insurance will cover you for the coming year. So in this case, you are paying in advance. We call it a prepayment or a prepaid account. And this is this should be reported as part of the current assets on the balance sheet. When it comes to liabilities, as we said, we have current and long term, depending on when we are planning to settle the liability or when is the maturity date of the liability. And last on the balance sheet, we have what we call the equity section of the balance sheet, which includes the capital that was invested to establish the company and later on, for example, in case we added more capital, plus a certain amount of retained earnings. The profits that were accumulated or retained by the company over a certain period of time. Any questions? And remember, the balance sheet is prepared at a certain specific point in time. Yani at the end of December, at the end of June, at the end of March. So it has to be prepared at a certain point in time. When it comes to the third financial statement, the cash flow statement, we have cash inflows and cash outflows. And as we said, we have one financial statement that focuses on cash flows because cash is extremely important. It helps us maintain the liquidity of the company. We cannot operate without having enough cash. This is why later on, the management accounting course, we'll see one type of budget, we call it the cash budget. And it's a very important budget that you set it up ahead of time for the coming year on a month-by-month basis. بقول أنا in this month I'm going to start with a certain amount of cash in my bank account. I'm going to receive a certain amount of cash from my clients. I have the following cash payments, and this is my expected cash position at the end of the month. إذا كان في عندي surplus, what do I do with this surplus? Do I keep it ولا بحطه in a saving account to get a certain amount of interest? وإذا كان في عندي deficit, what shall I do with the deficit? How should I cover it? في عندي $30,000 of deficit. شو بعمل بهالحالة؟ Shall I go and borrow? ولا shall I speed up the collection of receivables from the client? Or shall I delay some of the payment for the next month? So as you can see, budgets are very powerful tools. They allow you to plan ahead of time. And this will be covered later on in the management accounting course. حيكون في عنا different type of budgets, including sales budget. How much am I selling over the coming next year? So in this case, it helps you identify how much raw material you have to buy ahead of time to be able to meet the projected sales. بس نعرف قد ايه في عندنا sales وبس نعرف قديش بدنا production بنعرف قديش بدنا purchase of raw material. We know how much cash we have to pay and how much cash we are receiving from the clients, and in this case we can prepare the cash budgets, and we have different other type of budgets that we'll be discussing later on in management accounting. So cash is very important. This is why we have one financial statement that focuses on cash. So on the cash flow statement, we have a certain listing of all the inflows and the outflows, all the cash receipts and all the cash payments, And as we said, cash receipts and cash payments are split into three different categories: operating, investing, and financing. We said that operating cash flows arise mainly from the operations of the company, dealing with the clients, dealing with the suppliers, and so on and so forth. Investing activities are mainly related to cash inflows and outflows related to investing in long-term assets, buying, let's say, vehicles, buying a certain building, buying a certain piece of land, buying an equipment. All these are investments in long-term assets. When it comes to financing activities, we have two primary sources of financing activities: debt and equity. Either we borrow from a bank, or we issue a certain number of shares and we invite new shareholders or new partners to join us by investing a certain amount of capital in the company. Any questions about the cash flow statement? The last statement that we covered is the statement of retained earnings, which shows the amount of profits that have been accumulated over the past years minus the amount of profits that were distributed to the owners of the company or to the shareholders of the company. Any questions? What else did we cover? حكينا على financial statement. نعم.
We start by usually income statement.
Yes. Income statement, statement of retained earnings, and then the balance sheet, and then the cash flow statement. That's correct. What else did we discuss? حكينا على financial statements. That's correct. Did we talk about transaction analysis? The effect of specific transactions on the financial statements. Yani, when we collect an account receivable from a client, what will happen in this case to account receivable? Account receivable would decrease and cash would increase. This is what we call transaction analysis. We covered that, and I think we discussed it. And this would be the starting point for this workshop. We'll be talking a little bit about transaction analysis, just to jumpstart, if you want, our discussion of the new part of financial accounting. Any questions before we start? Any questions? Right. But a final note on this. In the first part of financial accounting, we introduced the different financial statements. Now we'll go a little bit in more details. We'll talk a little bit about some of the details related to the income statement, some of the details related to the balance sheet, and so on. So we'll go a little bit more in depth. Any questions? Questions? Right. Let's move on to discuss transaction analysis. Yeah. هذا الحيط ألوى. As you can see, it's like this. ايه. تعرف قديك? Do you know how much it cost this building? How much did it cost?
Mechanical work, mechanical كلف 2M it was.
لا in total.
50 million.
لا. Almost half. 24 million. Almost 24 million dollars.
السكوير متر كونستراكشن
ما بعرف قد ايه طلع. بس despite this fact ليك شوف يعني بتشوف مرات architecture related issues.
سيدي مش intentional اللي عملوه؟
ما بعرف. I don't know. بس ما بعرف. Anyway. طيب. When it comes to financial statements, actually financial statements, the figures on the financial statements are accumulated over time. يعني ما بنوصل ما بنفيق بنهار and the second day we have a balance sheet, an income statement, and so on. They arise from what we call transactions or event that occur on a daily basis. At the end of the month, at the end of the quarter, or at the end of the year, we compile all this information that we recorded on a daily basis to be able to generate the financial statements. So if you want, the starting point or the core constituent of financial statements is what we call transactions. Yani, example of transaction, we purchased an equipment, we paid salaries, we borrowed from a bank, and so on and so forth. All these are examples of transactions that occur on a daily basis. كل يوم بيجي لعنا زبون. We have a client that purchased a certain amount and he paid cash. Another client that he purchased certain amount of inventory and it was on account. We purchased some goods from a supplier. We paid electricity. We paid a certain amount of interest. We paid the salaries to the employees and so on. All these are examples of transactions, and we have, depending on the size of the company, we may have thousands and thousands of transactions on a daily basis. إذا كنا small company يمكن يكون في عنا hundreds or tens of transactions on a daily basis. At the end of the month, at the end of the quarter, or at the end of the year, what do? We compile all these transactions and we consolidate them in a certain financial report, including all the financial statements. بنشوف شو طلع في عنا all the revenues and we put them on the balance sheet. We look at the expenses and we report all the expenses on the income statement. We look at the assets, what are the total for cash, the total for account receivable, and so on and so forth. Okay? So the first part of our discussion, just to refresh your memory a little bit, is related to what we call transaction analysis. Let's take very simple example. What will happen when we collect an account receivable? When we collect, فينا نكتب هون. ما كتبنا. كان صار قصة. كانت كلفتنا another $500,000 لحتى اللي يرجعوا يدهنوا الحيط.
بيطلع الكاش.
What will happen when we collect an account receivable? Account receivable would decrease and cash would increase. That's correct. So as you can see in this case, we have two assets that are affected. So we're looking at the same side of the balance sheet. One asset is increasing, اللي هو cash, and another asset is decreasing. And remember, on the balance sheet has to be always balanced. The total of the assets have to be equal to the total of the liabilities plus the total of the equity accounts. So in this case, if one asset is increasing and another asset is decreasing. So in this case, the total of the assets did not change, and the total of the liabilities came in, no change, and the total of equity accounts has not changed. And I think you had an assignment. One problem in the assignment is related to increases and decreases. Type. What if we sold inventory to clients on account, let's say? What will happen in this case? Account receivable would increase. Like we sold on account, we did not sell for cash. Yes. Inventory would decrease, that's correct. What else? Revenue is going to increase. Can we have a revenue without having an expense? تتذكروا الماتching principle? What does it say? For every amount of revenue, you have to match a certain expense. What would be the expense in this case that we have? The cost of goods sold. The cost of goods sold is going to increase. اللي هو the cost of the inventory item that we are selling. لأنه هذا inventory items either would have produced it, and in this case, it would have costed us a certain amount to produce it. اللي هو مثل ما قلنا cost of labor, cost of material, and the cost of overheads. Or we would have purchased that item from a supplier, and in this case would have paid a certain cost to acquire that item.
Where does it appear?
Which one?
Cost of goods sold.
Cost of goods sold is an expense. Is an expense account. It has to be reported on the income statement as a deduction on the income statement. That's correct. Yes.
What if we're selling a service? We're not selling inventory.
ايه بيكون في عندك ما بيكون اسمه cost of goods sold, بيكون اسمه cost of sales. حتى لانه when you شوف شو بصير ايه بصير في عندك you would have a certain cost of sales, and in this case you would have to apply a certain cost of labor. مثلا بدنا نقول legal services. شو بيعمل المحامي؟ المحامي you talk to him on the phone, بيبعت لك اخر شيء البيل، بيقول لك on that date there was a certain phone call for 30 minutes, and for this phone call I'm going to charge you a certain amount. بلا بيحطوا لك sales less cost of sales وبصير في عندك a certain profit. But in this case, in the case of services companies, you are not selling a certain product. يعني ما في عندك cost of goods sold, بس في عندك cost, we call it cost of sales. اللي هو the cost that was incurred to generate the revenues.
As a company, how do you evaluate it? يعني اليوم بدنا نقول
Yes.
شوف معاش الموظف per month
Yes.
divided per hour بتقول ساعته بتكلفني هيك مع الاوفر هيد
That's correct.
$20.
That's correct. What they do in this case, they, مثلا lawyers, every lawyer has a certain portfolio of clients. Okay? وكل client is a job by itself. They use what we call job costing. وهذه بنشوفها بالaccounting later on بالmanagement accounting when it comes to the different costing systems. For every client, you have a certain, let's say, folder or a certain portfolio, and for this client, you have a certain amount of revenue that is generated and a certain amount of expenses that are incurred. Okay? هلا, when it comes to charging that client, شو بتعمل؟ بتقول أنا this person that's working on this client is like the cost per hour is, let's say, شو بعرفني $100 $200, and you add a certain markup, a certain profit margin. بتقول أنا 30% profit margin will be applied on a per hour rate. So إذا الريت تبعه هو الزلمة عم يشارجك $200, أنت you would charge the client $200 plus 30% اللي هي $60. The same for the overheads. بتقول أنا عم بدفع تنقول rent. Okay? Rent per square meter. طيب عال. How much is he consuming out of this amount? بتشارجه a certain amount. Electricity. And all the expenses are somehow, إذا بدك, distributed, or we say allocated on a job by job basis or on a department by department basis, حسب whatever is easier and more accurate when it comes to costing. Okay? So when it comes to providing services, you have to compute what we call a cost of sale, مش cost of goods sold. In this case, you are not selling a certain product. طيب. الاكاونتنتس الاكاونتنتس طيب borrowed from a bank. You borrowed, let's say, $10,000 from a bank. What would be the changes? Cash would increase. It's not an account payable, we call it notes payable. And if you remember, when we talk about accounts payable versus notes payable, we said that accounts payable don't bear interest, while in the case of notes payable, they bear interest. And in addition to this, when it comes to accounts payable, بيكون في عنا an invoice, a simple invoice from the supplier, ونحن we stamp it as received. لما بنعمل stamp as received, what does it mean? We're acknowledging this liability. صح؟ In the case of a bank, ما في عنا invoice من البنك. You have to sign شو بيمضونا؟ سندات الكمبيالات, right? So in this case, you have a certain note that you have to sign. So in the case of note payable and account payable, you have two primary differences. Notes payable bear interest while accounts payable don't. And notes payable, they include a formal promissory note that you have to sign. بدك تمضي على السندات, بدك تمضي على الكمبيالات, and you have to specify the date. In the case of accounts payable, you don't sign anything. You just stamp the invoice as received and that's it. ما في عنا other legal documents that you have to sign. When? In the case of accounts payable,
لا عم بحكي بالترانزاكشن.
hey, as time passes, when you sign the notes payable, there is no interest that's accumulated yet. As time passes, yes, you start accounting for the interest. But at this time you borrow, خلاص, there is no interest that is accumulated yet. You just borrowed $10,000. So your liability at that point in time is only $10,000. As time passes, you have to accrue a certain amount of interest. صح.
النوت بيبل او السندات already بقلبهم في الانترست.
But in this case, you have to account for the face value of the note separate and for the interest separate. So the note itself is separate from the interest related to the notes. You account for them differently. Yes, you account for the interest as an expense on the income statement. If it was paid in cash, it would be associated with a decrease in cash. If it was not paid, بيصير في عنا increase in liabilities related to interest اللي هي بنقول لها interest payable. Okay?
Are we being accurate هون؟ عم ناخذ we're taking a loan with a specific interest, let's say one sum, and we're not reporting it at this stage.
لأنه at this point in time خليني أسألك سؤال. We signed the note payable هلا, we went out of the bank and then ربحت اللوتري تنقول. And in this case, you went back to the bank at the same hour and you wanted to pay. What would be your liability at that point in time?
The amount without
Theoretically, it should be only the amount of the note. After 1 month, if you wanted to pay back the loan, you would have to pay the note payable plus whatever amount of interest that has accrued for one month.
So what will be the
So theoretically, at the time you sign the note payable, you are only liable for the amount that you borrowed. As time passes, you have to account for a certain amount of interest cost or interest expense. But at the time of signature, you are only liable for the face value of the note. Yes, Hamad.
Payment has to carry interest.
Usually yes. Usually yes.
So if there is a promissory note to be paid without interest, it's only a note payment.
Without?
It will not be a note.
Well, normally notes payable, they do carry interest. Any questions? Right. What will happen, for example, if you paid?
Sorry, Simon.
يلا.
Sometimes
نعم.
Sometimes you borrow money and they calculate. Okay, yeah, I got it. So if you borrow a certain amount and then they calculate the interest that you will have to pay over a certain period, they divide it and then you have to pay back.
Okay.
So
Like in the case of a mortgage, for example.
yeah,
Aye.
so you account for the additional interest separately. So here the
صح.
accounts payable with three set interest that
صحيح.
is accounted.
صحيح. And you compare the total amount of the payments with the amount that you borrowed. You borrowed 100,000. you will repay it 150. So in this case, you have a difference of $50,000, which is related to interest. So the face value of the note in this case is 100,000. But later on, as time passes, you have to account for an additional amount of interest, which is equivalent to $50,000 of interest. Okay? But you account for them separate from the note. And the note is different from the interest that is accrued on the notes.
But immediately you have an interest payable of 50.
لا ما في عندك interest payable لأنه interest did not accrue yet. لأنه in this case أنا شو بعرفني you may repay the loan after 1 year. And in this case your liability is only related to an interest of 1 year. You're not liable for the full amount up front. Unless إذا بدك ما بعرف هيدي how to account for it. Unless لنقول the loan is non-cancelable. ما فيك. You cannot go out of the loan. You cannot repay the loan before the end of the maturity or before the maturity date. Then in this case, you are automatically liable for the full amount. Okay? Even كمان مظبوط. If you pay upfront في عندك a certain penalty which is a percentage of the outstanding balance. ما تخاف عليهم. شاطرين البنوك. طيب. What would happen when we pay salaries to employees? Cash would decrease, of course. Cash would decrease and would decrease.
Liability will decrease.
لا ما في عندنا liability لأنه the amount was paid. صح? Yes. So in this case we have a certain salaries. لا salaries expense would increase. هلا in case the salaries were not paid before مظبوط بيكون في عنا salaries payable, we decrease the payable and we decrease cash. But in this case we are paying the salaries for the current month. So in this case we have an expense and we have a decrease in cash. يلا بس اعطيني لحظة. Why do we have an expense? لأنه matching principle tells us the following. Do you remember the matching principle? Did we get any benefit from the services provided by the employees? Yes, so we have to match an expense. What is the expense related to the service provided by employees? شو expense related to services provided by employees? Salaries, right? هن they generate a certain benefit اللي هو revenue. Then they help us sell the product or sell the service to the client. But in this case, what's the expense related to serving to the services of the employees? هو salary that is paid. Plus other expenses هيدوليكي مظبوط. بس انه basically you have the salaries. يمكن فيك تزيد عليها البنشن، فيك تزيد عليها retirement plan and so on and so forth. يمكن مرات بتعطيهم let's say other benefits such as insurance, such as commissions, such as let's say subsidy for rent لنقول and so on and so forth. These are other expenses. But normally the common expense related to services provided by employees is their salaries.
Commissions, they fall into
commissions. لأنه this is separate. A salary is fixed. A commission is variable.
But you're paying it through the salary.
Yes, but you keep it separate. You account for it separate. لأنه you would like to know how much salaries you are paying on a yearly basis or monthly basis, and you would like to keep track of the commissions that are paid.
مثل dividends.
ايه بس الديفيدنس ليك بس الديفيدنس is a little bit different لأنه هون we are talking about employees while dividends is normally distributed لمين؟ للpartners, للshareholders. So it's a little bit different. dividends, by the way, remember dividends is not an expense. It's not تتذكروا قلنا underline, bold and so on. Dividends is not an expense. Dividends is a distribution of profit. طيب. So now.
When we say cash is in the bank
Which
sheet,
one?
The fourth.
This one, yes.
The cash is decreased. It's on the balance sheet.
It's on the balance sheet. It shows.
It's the income.
هلا بتشوف.
كيف عملت؟
يلا بلي. When cash decreases, this is going to affect the balance sheet and the cash flow statement. صح؟ لأنه this would represent a certain decrease in cash or a certain cash outflow that has to be reported on the cash flow statement. طيب. هلا in this case يلا شباب. In this case we have a decrease in assets. So in this case the asset side of the balance sheet would decrease So how are we going to balance the equation? The retained earnings. And when you have more expenses, you will have less profits. If you have less profits, you would have less retained earnings. And in this case, you would have a decrease on the asset side and a decrease on the equity side of the balance sheet. Questions?
It wasn't the assignment.
ايه صح بس هيك just a refresher. What will happen when you settle the notes payable? We borrowed honey, so in this case now we are repaying the notes.
Cash decrease.
Cash would decrease. صحيح. Would decrease. Okay? ايه هلا الانترست هون بعد ما حكينا على الانترست عم نحكي بس على النوت. إذا بدك what will happen for example when we pay interest on notes payable? Cash is going to decrease. We have a certain expense related to interest that's going to increase. ليش في عندنا interest expense كمان? We go back to the matching principle. Did we get any benefit from using the notes payable, from using the cash? Yes. So in this case we have to match an expense. What is the expense related to borrowing a certain amount of cash? The expense is related to interest, and we call it interest expense, which is the cost of borrowing. Any questions?
Sometimes you
No.
borrow and you negotiate cash discounts and they offset each other.
ما فهمت.
يعني اليوم if I borrowed $100,000
No.
and I incurred an interest of 5%. I went and I repaid upfront.
ايه هلا ما هيدا الانترست the amount of interest you are not booking it up front.
Okay. So ما بيصير شيء ما didn't pay.
You did, yes. So in this case, this is why we don't record the interest up front. لما بنروح when we go and borrow, we only account for the face value, and as time passes, we account for whatever interest that we incur. Okay. So and this is in line with what you are saying.
And what if I make money out of borrowing?
ساعتها بيكون في عندك a certain expense related to the notes payable, وبيكون في عندك a certain interest revenue that was generated from blocking a certain amount of cash for a certain period of time. يعني مثلا هلا إذا بدك real estate mortgage بيقولوا لك well we'll give you a certain option, let's say إذا minimum payment لنقول 20%, لنقول طلعت لنقول $200,000 20%. If you block a certain amount, or if you deposit this amount in a saving account, throughout the life of the mortgage, بنوطي لك الانترست rate from a certain, let's say 5 or 6% to 3 or 4%. لأنه in this case, what do? Whatever amount that is blocked is invested to generate a certain amount of return. They will benefit.
اللي عم بيعطيك اياه على 200,000
اللي عم يعطيك اياه على 200 بصير في عندك مثل offsetting factor or offsetting balance. Okay? So in this case when it comes to interest, we don't account for the interest upfront. We accrue the interest as time passes. Sorry, Muhammad.
In the sixth example,
No.
the payment of cash should be offset by a decrease in liability, so interest payable should decrease also.
Where? هون؟
In example number 6.
إذا بدك if we were accruing interest, بس إذا كنا if we were paying interest on a monthly basis, كل شهر بشهره, at the end of the month, we record a certain expense related to interest and we pay cash. مزبوط, you are right. If interest was not paid, then in this case we reduce interest payable and we reduce cash. But in this case we are assuming the interest is paid on a regular basis. بشكل ما عم بيكون في عنا interest payable. Yes.
But change in asset should lead to a change in liability to be valued.
مش ضروري liabilities. In this case, a decrease in cash, a decrease in cash is going to decrease the assets. While increase in expenses is going to decrease the retained earnings on the equity side of the balance sheet. ليش؟ لأنه as you have more expenses, you have less profits. So you're expected to have less retained profits or retained earnings. And in this case, the equation would balance. So it's not necessary أنه يكون ال counterbalance or the balancing factor an increase in liabilities. Any questions? Type. In accounting, normally we don't use increases and decreases. What do we normally use in accounting? debit and credit. And last time, if I recall well, we covered a little bit of debits and credits. وقلنا إنه when it comes to assets, liability, equity accounts, and so on, we report them, or we can, إذا بدنا, we can display the assets, liability, and equity accounts, and so on as a T account. And the T account in this case has two sides, the left side and the right side. And for assets, the left side has always the plus sign, and the right side has always the minus side. And in this case, the left side is always the debit side, and the right side is always the credit side. And as you can see in this case, the pluses and minuses are distributed differently for assets, liability, and equity accounts. The same for revenues, expenses, and so on. What does this slide say? Well, for assets, any increase in assets should be reported as a debit. Any decrease in assets has to be reported as a credit. For, let's say, liabilities, any increase in liabilities should be reported as a credit. Any decrease in liabilities is reported as a debit. For revenues, let's say, any increase in revenues is reported as a credit, and any decrease is reported as a debit. Did we explain the rationale behind it last time? ما حكينا على الراشونال. طيب. اي هلا بنشوف، هلا بناخذ examples. Let's explain the rationale. When it comes to assets, you have to take it as granted, as a given, and the plus is always on the left side, and the minus is always on the credit side. So what does it mean? To increase an asset, we have to debit that asset, and to decrease an asset, we have to credit the assets. هلا بنحكي، طول بالك، هلا بنوصل لها. It's very important هيدي. هلا بنحكي. لأنه أنت you are looking from the supplier's perspective. بيبعت لك الانفويس، أنت بتقراها، بس this invoice is from the supplier's perspective. هلا بنحكي عنها. Give me 2 minutes. This is very important. And this is actually one of the main reasons I cover debits and credits. I don't want to go too much into the details of debit and credit لأنه هيدا pure accounting. But it's very important انه يا عمي طب انا بتجيني البانك account بس it does not make sense. It's from the other side of the equation اذا بدك. وهلا بنشوف ليش. Just give me 1 second. طيب. As you can see, for all accounts, the debits and the credits are on the same side. The debit is on the left and the credit is on the right. Only the pluses and minuses are distributed differently. Right. Let's take the assets. As we said, for the assets, you take it as granted. The plus is on the left side and the minus is on the right side. For the liabilities and for the equity accounts, the pluses and minuses are opposites. ليش they are opposite? Do you remember the equation on the balance sheet? Assets are equal to liabilities plus equity accounts. So they are on the other side of the equation. So in this case, they cannot have the same signs like assets. They should have two opposite signs. So as you can see in this case, for liabilities, the pluses and the minuses are flipped. مش مثل asset, they are opposite to the assets. For capital, كمان they are opposite to the assets. لأنه capital is part of equity accounts. For retained earnings, كمان the pluses and the minuses are flipped. They are opposite to the assets. طيب. What about revenues and expenses and dividends? We'll get to dividends later on. Let's talk about dividends. انتوا برايكم dividends should be opposite to which account?
Dividends is like we asked.
Opposite to retained earnings.
Opposite to retained earnings. This is the simplest approach. ليش؟ لأنه as you distribute more in the form of dividends, شو بصير بالretained earnings? It would go down. So in this case, retained earnings and dividends should have opposite signs. What about revenues? Revenues opposite to expenses, بس بعد ما عارفين لا revenues ولا expenses what is the sign distribution. So what would be the sign distribution for revenues?
إذا عم بيطلع منه.
So to which account should we relate revenues?
Asset
To retained earnings.
To retained earnings. ليش retained earnings? As you have more revenues, you have more profits. As you have more profits, you are expected to have more retained earnings. So revenues and retained earnings should have similar signs. The opposite for the expenses. As you have more expenses, you have less profit. As you have less profits, you have less retained earnings. So in this case, they should have opposite sign. So if you think about it, the starting point is the assets. We say, well, for the asset, it's given as a granted, or you have to take it as granted, and the plus and the minus are distributed as such. For liabilities, share capital and retained earnings, the distribution is opposite. Okay? For dividends, it's opposite to the retained earnings. For revenues, it's similar to retained earnings, and for expenses, it's opposite to retained earnings. What's the reason? As you distribute more dividends, you retain less. So they are opposite. As you have more revenues, you have more profits. You have more retained profits. So in this case, they should be similar, and the opposite is true for the expenses. Okay? Let's go to the bank side, or to the bank statement. Let's go to the supplier's invoice and see why do we have this confusion. Debit, انت بتقول لي عم تقول لي debit مش دايما is a plus. Yes, correct, that's correct. Let's look at the reason. Think about your bank account. From your perspective, your bank account is an asset. The cash that you have in the bank is part of your asset. So any deposit that you make in your bank account should increase your assets, and in this case you account for it as a debit, and any withdrawal from the bank account should result in a decrease in that asset, and it should be reported as a credit. Agreed? لأنه هلا بقول لك ليش. From your perspective شفت هلا بقول لك ليش credit. شفت كيف؟ أنت from your perspective, the cash that you have in the bank is your asset.
Yes.
صح ولا لا؟ When you deposit cash, your asset is increasing, and to increase your asset, you have to debit it, and the opposite is true. When you get the bank statement, it's from the other perspective, from their perspective. Your deposit in the bank is a liability for the bank. ليش؟ لأنه anytime you can go and claim it, هن شو لازم يعملوا؟ They should give you back your cash. So in this case, any deposit that you make is going to increase the bank's liability. And to increase the bank's liability, it should be credited by the bank. And any withdrawal that you make is going to reduce the liability of the bank. And the bank reduces its liability by debiting your account. This is why لما بتجيك البنك statement, your balance is on the credit side. ليش؟ لأنه this statement was printed by the bank, and your account in the bank is a liability account. بالنسبة للloans for the bank, it's the opposite. It's their assets. أنت بالنسبة لك اللون is a liability, while for the bank it's an asset for the bank. So in this case, you have to look at the equation from whose perspective are we looking at. The same for suppliers. When it comes to the supplier, you have a liability to the supplier. You have an account payable. For the supplier, he has an account receivable. So from the supplier's side, you would have a debit balance. From our side, we have a credit balance. So this is very important. And this is actually the only reason I go over debits and credits. As you can see, it's a very simple notion, but it can be a little bit confusing. مثل ما صار هلا مع سامر انه يا عمي كيف طب ما هي it's a credit. البنك بيكون on the credit side. It is on the credit side for a simple reason. لأنه for the bank, your deposit is a liability. And this is why when you make more deposits, the bank is more liable. And in this case, the liability is increasing. So this is why they credit your account. And when you withdraw from your bank account, your liability, the liability of the bank is decreasing. This is why they debit your account. For the suppliers, you have a liability to the supplier, and the supplier has a receivable from you. Okay? So for it should be on the debit side. لأنه from his side he has a receivable from you. The bank,
He's sending me his statement, not my statement.
he's sending your balance based on his accounting records. This is why, مظبوط. This is why the balance that you have in the bank account should be on, normally should be on the credit side. إذا كان معنا مصاري، إذا ما كان في مصاري، إذا كان في عنا overdraft, it would be on the opposite side. Right? سامر
السبلاير لما بيجيب لك اكونت ستيت اكونت بيكون مصريته بالدبت سايد.
Should be on the debit side لأنه this is a receivable. This is an asset for the supplier. هو عم بيطلع statement من accounting system عنده. Right? So in this case it should be on the asset side لأنه it represents a receivable from you as a company or as an individual. Okay? We don't need to go too much into the details of debits and credits, but it's very interesting to know a debit is not always a plus and a credit is not always a minus. It depends from which side are you looking at debits and credits. And we gave two very simple and interesting examples. The first one is for the bank. For us, our cash in the bank is an asset. So when we deposit cash, our asset should increase, so we should debit our asset, and the opposite is true. لما بنعمل withdrawal we should credit it. But from the bank's perspective, your deposit is a liability. Any increase in liability is credited, and any decrease in liability is debited.
Assets are debit by nature, so any increase in assets is a debit. Liabilities are credit by nature. Any increase in liability is a credit.
شو يعني debit by nature and credit by nature؟ إذا بدك you can follow these accounts by looking at the plus sign. يعني the natural balance for assets is debit. The natural balance for liability is credit. The natural balance for share capital is credit, or the expected balance إذا بدك is always on the plus side. يعني for expenses they should have a debit balance. For revenues they should have a credit balance, and so on and so forth. هلا in this case you don't need to memorize except assets, plus on the left, plus on the debit side, minus on the right. The others can be easily derived. ليش؟ لأنه the liabilities and the equity accounts, share capital and retained earnings are on the opposite side of the equation. So the pluses and the minuses should be flipped. For dividends, it's opposite to retained earnings. لأنه as you distribute more dividends, you retain less. Revenues, similar to retained earnings. For a simple reason, لأنه as you have more revenues, you have more profits. As you have more profits, you retain more. So in this case, revenues and retained earnings, they go in the same direction. And the opposite for expenses. Okay? So in accounting, we don't use increases and decreases actually. We use debits and credits. Questions? Let's try to do some applications. Let's go back to whatever we did before and try to convert them from increases, decreases to debits and credits. Did we do that assignment before ولا ما عملناها هيدي؟ ما عملناها. طيب. Let's take the first one. Account receivable is decreasing and cash is increasing. So what shall we do in this case?
Debit increase.
We debit?
Debit assets.
أي asset منهم? Which one? Both of them are assets. This is an asset and this is an asset. We have one asset that is increasing and we have an asset that is decreasing.
Debit cash, credit receivable.
So we debit cash and we credit account receivable. Let's think about it. Cash is an asset and this asset is increasing. How do we increase an asset by a certain amount? By debiting that asset. Account receivable كمان is an asset. But this asset is شو عم بيصير فيه؟ Decreasing. How do we decrease an asset by a certain amount? We have to credit that asset. So in this case, when we collect account receivables, as accountant, what we do simply, we record a certain entry, debiting cash and crediting account receivable. We don't think about increases and decreases. We think automatically debits and credits. How do we convert? يلا.
I recorded DR.
Yes. لأنه الكريدت هو CR فالدebit they refer to it as DR. How do we convert from pluses and minuses to debits and credits? It's very simple. All you need to do is to follow this chart. It's very simple. Right, let's move on to the second one. We sold a certain amount of inventory to clients on accounts. We said that account receivable is going to increase, revenues are going to increase, inventory is going to decrease, and cost of goods sold is going to decrease. Yalla, take 1 minute. Which accounts should be debited and which accounts should be credited? Yalla, think about it for 1 minute. Yalla, let's start with the first one. Account receivable is it is increasing. To increase an asset by a certain amount, we need to debit that asset. So we debit account receivable. Revenue is a revenue account. And it is increasing, so we need to credit revenues. Inventory is an asset. It is decreasing, so how do we? We credit that asset. Cost of goods sold is an expense account. It is increasing. So how do we increase an expense account? By debiting that expense. As you can see, the equation is always balanced. For every one or more debits, we should have one or more credits so that the equation is always balanced.
That's in all financial statements.
Yes.
Because a credit in revenue is a debit in maybe a debit in dividends.
Like revenues, they generate more profits. They result in more profits. And in this case, yes. It flows on the income statement. And later on, those profits may be distributed. And I'll balance بيهمني mostly on the balance sheet. This is the only statement that should be always balanced. بيكون في عندي total of the assets is equal to the total of the liabilities minus or plus the total of equity accounts. On the income statement, I don't care about balance لأنه بده يكون في عندي أكيد either a profit or a loss. يا إما revenues are greater than the expenses or the opposite is true. On the statement of cash flow كمان ما بيهمني يكون في عندي balance. I care only about the cash inflows and the cash outflows. On the statement of retained earnings كمان the balance is not an option. The only statement whereby balance is important or is relevant is when it comes to the balance sheet. I need to have the total of the assets equal to the total of the liabilities plus the total of equity accounts. But as we did last time, the numbers in one financial statements are going to flow in certain way or another from one financial statement to the other. مثل ما حكينا, on the income statement we compute profits. Those profits are retained on the statement of retained earnings, which is later reported on the balance sheet under equity accounts, right? So as you can see, the statements are interrelated. And I think we gave one example last time, when we started that company, do you remember? And we prepared the different financial statements on the board, on the wall, and you saw how the different figures flow from one financial statement to another. Let's go to the next one. What will happen when we borrow from a bank a certain amount of cash? Cash is an asset, so we debit cash and we credit notes payable. What will happen when we pay salaries to employees?
Salary expense
Debited, لأنه we have an increase in expense and cash is going to be credited. When we settle a notes payable,
cash credit
it's going to decrease, so we credit cash and we debit. As you can see in all cases, for every one or more debits, we have one or more equivalent credit. The last one, interest expense increasing, So we debit the expense and we credit. Okay? So in accounting, actually, we don't use increases and decreases. We use debits and credits. And to convert or to, إذا بدنا migrate from increases, decreases, pluses and minuses to debits and credits, the migration is very simple. We just need to know the nature of the account. لما بحكي أنا على deposit in the bank, my deposit is an asset. So now it's very simple. Once I know the nature of the account, I know that any increase should be reported as a debit and any decrease should be reported as a. When I borrow from a bank, the note payable is a liability. So in this case, any increase should be reported as a credit and any decrease should be reported as a debit. So once I understand the nature of the account, it's very simple to convert the pluses and the minuses into debits and credits.
That's why when we say we pay on credit, يعني it is an asset.
Should you pay on credit?
When you borrow, let's say, which borrow? When you buy something and you say I'll pay it on credit. It's an okay.
When you buy something on account, so in this case you are assuming purchase something on account, purchase inventory on account. Yeah. You purchased inventory on account. So in this case, so when you purchase inventory on account, you purchase inventory on credit or on account, على حساب يعني. Your inventory is going to increase and your accounts payable is going to increase, right? If you buy inventory on account, اشتريت stock وما دفعت للسبلايرز, you purchase it on account. So in this case, your inventory is going to increase and your accounts payable is going to increase. So in this case, this is an asset, we have to debit it, and this is a liability, we have to credit it. Once you pay to suppliers, 8. صح. بصير في عندك more stock. صح. It's an asset. An asset should be increased by debiting that asset, and a liability is going to increase. So you have to credit your payable. طيب. Paid to suppliers. You pay a certain amount of cash, so your cash should decrease, and your payables should decrease. How do you settle that amount? By paying a certain amount of cash. Cash is an asset, it is decreasing, so you need to credit cash. Accounts payable is a liability, it is decreasing, so you need to.
Some statements they refer to debit as DB, not DR.
Usually DR they use. Usually DR. And for credit they use CR.
This R, there is no R in debit.
ايه؟
There is no letter R.
ايه there is no R in debit, بس لأنه الكريدت هي CR، لأنه الكريدت هي CR, so they refer to debit as DR. Okay? Here it should be that all DB إذا بدك. بس إنه they don't refer to it as DB, they refer to it as DR. ليش؟ لأنه الكريدت is a CR. هلا what do we mean by debits and credits? There is no meaning. There is no meaning. These are technical terms or terminologies that are associated with a meaning. مثل مثلا in the case of mathematics, let's say. طب شو what do we mean by integral? شو هالكلمة هيدي وشو هالsymbol? Right? Integral. Right? So in this case, it does not have a meaning by itself, but it is associated with a specific meaning اللي هي the area under a specific curve. صح? It is associated with a specific meaning. Like in the case of differential equation. طب شو differential equation? شو exponential? e to the power ما بعرف. It does not have a meaning by itself. Logarithm, log or ln, right? It does not have a meaning by itself, but it is associated with a specific meaning.
They are using lots of credit terminology for saying مثلا purchasing something on account.
On account.
Or on credit.
Hey.
We are using the term credit sometimes to
In this case لأنه in this case the term credit, it means that you are purchasing something on account. You're not paying in cash. Correct. Any questions? Any questions? طيب, before we go to the break, let's go. يلا. Before we go, يلا بعد ربع ساعة خلينا للنص. Just to be a little bit more efficient. نخلص as much material as we can. طيب. For إذا بدنا practice purposes, let's have some additional practice in addition to the ones that we had before. Let's take this one. يلا 2 minutes. Which accounts should be debited and which accounts should be credited? You invested $40,000 in a business, you got a certain number of shares in exchange. But only we are talking about the company's perspective. We are talking about the company. What happened on the company's balance sheet? On the company's account.
company صار عندها 40,000 كاش وصار عندها
Cash more. Capital. صح. Okay. So we don't account for those transactions from an individual perspective. Always we take the perspective of the company. طيب. Done? We are not looking at this transaction from an individual perspective. We are looking at this transaction from the perspective of the company that you are investing in. أنت عملت investment in a certain company. You invested 40,000. صح. لا ما في شيء صح وغلط. It depends on from which perspective. Yes, that's it. From which perspective are you looking at? يلا.
ما بقدر
So in this case, what will happen? For the company, cash has to increase, and for the company, the capital of the company is going to increase. Cash is an asset. So in this case, cash has to be debited, and capital is an equity account. It has to be. ما بيأثر. As you can see in accounting, we are very anxious or we are very careful when it comes to the date. لأنه later on, certain transactions, the impact of those transactions is going to be dependent on the date of the transaction. So in the case of recording transactions, we are very careful when it comes to the date. We have to specify. When did we borrow? When did we pay cash? When did we pay salaries? When did we pay interest? It's very important to keep track of the date. لأنه financial statements are prepared for a certain period of time or at a certain specific point in time. So we have to be very careful when it comes to tracking the date of a specific transaction or the date of a specific event. Any questions? Type. The next one, we paid $600 cash for wages or for salaries. يلا cash. ناخد 1 minute بس. خلينا. Let's take 1 minute. Think about it for 1 minute and then we go over it. نعم.
نحن كنا عم نحط كاش دائما بس يكون ماينس البالانس شيت هيدا بتوين بالانس. هلا اذا عم نحطهم هون مع ديبت كريدت.
اي بنحط ديبت كريدت. ما بنحط لا. ما بنحطهم نيجاتيف لا. بس انت لانه بس تعرف انه we have a debit to an asset, it means this is a plus. When we have a credit to an asset, this is a minus. It's automatically known.
هيدي على موديل.
ايه؟ ما بعرف رولا if she posted them.
نقدر نطبعهم لون.
ايه
او ملونه او اتليست بيضه.
Hey, I'll ask Rola to post them on Moodle. Okay. Okay. So what will happen when we pay salaries? $600. Cash would decrease, and we have an expense that is. So cash is going to decrease, and we have expenses. Which type of expense in this case? Salaries expense is going to increase. So what do we do in this case? We are going to credit cash, and we are going to debit the expense. And the effect on this case of the expense account, شو هيعمل بالequity? Expense. Expense is going to reduce the equity. ليش؟ لأنه as we have more expenses, we have less profits and we have less retained earnings. هيدي الماينس, it does not mean إنه the expense is going to decrease. No, the equity is going to decrease. لأنه the expense in this case is going to increase. Okay? Any questions? Questions?
لهم بس بالنسبة لمحطوط accounts.
ايه بنحط اسم الاكونت cash should be credited and salaries expense should be debited. طيب. We purchased an office equipment for $5,200 and we signed a promissory note in exchange. We signed. يلا let's take 1 minute. يلا.
Depends on the day.
ما في interest بعد. You are signing, you just signed the note. يلا. Which accounts are affected in this case? Equipment and notes payable. Equipment is increasing and notes payable is increasing. Equipment is an asset, it should be debited. Note payable is a liability, it should be credited. وين؟ هيدا لأنه later on you have to account for interest.
Once you know وحدة automatically بتلاقي العكس.
مرات يمكن يكون في عندك أكثر من وحدة. يكون في عندك 4 أو 5 بنفس الوقت. يلا. يلا. Received $4,000. يلا please شباب. Received $4,000 for services rendered. So in this case, cash is going to increase. So we need to debit cash. Yes. And this is a revenue that is increasing. How do we increase the revenue account? By crediting a revenue. And of course, the increase in revenue is going to result in an increase in equity.
Retained earnings.
اللي هي retained earnings. كمان if you want to be more specific, كمان لازم يكون في عندنا an expense. لأنه we cannot generate a revenue without incurring an expense. هلا هون they are only accounting for the change in revenue. Okay? لأنه every revenue that is generated has to be accompanied by a certain amount of expenses that are incurred. هون ما عم يحكوا على expenses, they are focusing more on the revenues. Now, come on.
انا هون حطيت cash increase, retained earnings increase.
مظبوط اللي هي equity. بس retained earnings does not automatically increase. Retained earnings increases لأنه you have more revenues that resulted in more profits, that resulted in more retained earnings, that resulted in an increase in equity. Okay? So مش directly retained, يعني the effect is not direct on retained earnings. The effect is direct on the revenues. The revenues are going to result in more profits. More profits result in more retained earnings, and more retained earnings are going to result in more equity. Okay? صحيح. لأنه في عندك effect of taxes. صحيح. والexpenses. صح. طيب. The next one. لا بنحط revenue. The next one. We paid a short-term liability of $7,000. Cash would decrease. So in this case, we need to شو بنعمل? Credit cash. What else? accounts payable or notes payable, if you want, would decrease, and then we debit actually, that's correct. We debit the liability for a certain amount. So in this case, the assets are going to decrease and the liabilities are going to decrease. The next one. What does it mean to declare a cash dividends? The board of directors met and they decided, well, they announced, no, we are going to distribute a certain amount of profit of a day, $5,000. Did they actually distribute it? Not yet. Not yet. Yalla, think about it for 1 minute. Yalla, هلا أعمل. خلاص, yalla, that's it. So which accounts are affected in this case? Dividends. Dividends. And dividends payable. Dividends payable شو صار فيها? What happened to dividends payable? It's increasing. So in this case, how do we increase a liability by a certain amount? By crediting that liability. What about dividends? We are distributing more dividends. So dividends is increasing. How do we increase dividends accounts? By debiting. Of course, some of you, I heard you saying retained earnings. Of course, retained earnings will be affected. But retained earnings won't be affected directly. It will be affected through the effect of dividends. لأنه as you have more dividends, شو بصير بالretained earnings? Retained earnings would decrease later on. مظبوط, معك حق. لا, they did not pay. Declared. We will pay later on. So in this case, we have a liability. We call it dividends payable.
Dividend payable is a liability.
صح. So in this case, liabilities are going to increase and equity is going to decrease. ليش؟ لأنه in this case, as you have more dividends, you would retain less. You would retain less. And in this case, retained earnings would be less. And in this case, the equity would decrease. يلا يا شباب. يلا, any questions? يلا, any questions? Questions? Johnny? سام؟ ماشي الحال؟ يلا. حليت؟ يلا, حليت. طيب. Look at this transaction. It's a little bit different. It is a little bit different. What did we do in this case? We converted a certain liability into a certain amount of equity. Yani, somebody lended you, let's say $80,000. You don't have any cash to pay. What do you tell him in this case? Why don't you be my partner? بعطيك حصة من الشركة تبعي. So in this case, we'll remove the liabilities وبعطيك اسهم وبعطيك حصة بالcompany. So in this case, which accounts would be affected? Notes payable. Note payable. In this case, dividends should increase, by the way. Hey, note payable would شو؟ increase ولا decrease? Decrease. ولا شو بدي أعطيه So in this case, we need to debit it. What else? The capital of the company is going to increase. So we need to credit this. So in this case, we are converting a certain amount of debt into capital or into equity.
Why is it not payable?
لأنه اعتبرناها إنه note payable. It could be an account payable. ما في مشكلة. It could be an account. It could be an account payable or a note payable. ما في مشكلة. Any questions? Questions? طيب. We paid $16,000 to acquire a van. نشتري distribution of our products. أي assets? Cash would decrease. So we credit. أي fixed assets? Vehicles بنقول لهم. We call them vehicles are going to increase and this should be recorded as a debit. لأنه vehicles is an asset. So in this case, لاحظوا, we have an increase in one asset اللي هو vehicle and we have a decrease in another asset اللي هو cash and there is no change in liability and equity accounts. I think بعد في عنا وحدة 1 or 2 and then خلص that's it. That's it. يلا هاي مروان is keeping track exactly of time. نعم؟ ايه vehicle or the van yes is a long term asset. حسب depends. Normally vehicles are depreciated in mileage. حسب المايلج. انت في عندك سيارة ما عم تسوقها it does not depreciate. إذا مشيت 1000 مايل إذا مشيت 100 مايل it's going to be depreciated.
عندك 4 years.
لا مش بالضرورة. هلا حسب للدولة مرات مبلا بيجبروك.
للدولة عم يجبرونا 4 years.
مزبوط مرات بيجبروك صحيح. صحيح صحيح. مرات بيكون في عندهم مثل هيك إذا بدك the recommendation إنه this is how you should depreciate the assets. So, for the first part of the workshop, we had a certain refresh of what we did last time. كمان the second part of the workshop, كمان بدنا نعمل شوية refresh على ال financial statements. When it comes to the second part of the report or the second part of our discussion, we'll be talking about financial statements in general, and we'll be discussing the different type of financial reports that are provided when it comes to financial accounting. So when it comes to financial statements, actually, we'll have an overview. We'll discuss, for example, the difference between the cash basis and the accrual basis of accounting. As you know, when it comes to revenues and expenses, certain revenues are in cash and certain expenses are in cash. And at the same time, certain revenues may be on account, بنبيع لزبون on account, and certain expenses كمان may be on account. هون بيكون في عنا account receivable, هون بيكون في عنا account payable. صح؟ لما بنقول accrual basis بنكون عم نحكي both cash and non-cash, receivables and payable. When we talk about the cash basis of accounting, we are only looking at cash inflows and cash outflows. So, any sales on credit to our clients is not accounted for under the cash basis. يعني under the cash basis of accounting, we focus on cash inflows and cash outflows. Anything that does not result, or any transaction that does not result, في شيء تحت anything that does not result in a certain cash inflow or a cash outflow is not accounted for under the cash basis of accounting. ليش؟ لأنه by definition, when we talk about the cash basis of accounting, we are mainly talking about cash inflows and cash outflows. Under the accrual basis of accounting, بنكون عم نحكي على الكاش and account receivables when it comes to revenues. بنكون هون عم نحكي على cash outflows and accounts payable when it comes to expenses. So as you can see, the accrual basis is more broad or is broader. ليش؟ لأنه when it comes to cash receipts, we are not only focusing on cash receipts, we are also focusing on credit sales to clients. When it comes to expenses, we are not looking only at those expenses that were paid in cash. We are looking at those expenses that were accrued, that were on account. لما بيكون في عنا accrued expenses or expenses that were not paid. So, when it comes to accounting and the preparation of financial reports, we may use basically two bases in accounting, the cash basis and the accrual basis. When it comes to the cash basis, we look only at cash inflows and cash outflows. When it comes to the accrual basis, we look at non-cash items such as account receivable and the payables, salaries payable, taxes payable, income, interest payable, and so on and so forth. So, in short, what you need to know is the following. When we talk about the cash basis, we are looking only at cash inflows and cash outflows. When we are talking about the accrual basis of accounting, we are talking about non-cash and cash items. Okay? We talk a little bit about the cash flow statement. We'll talk about the operating, the investing, and the financing section of the cash flow statement. The first financial statement that we'll be discussing is the income statement. Yes. تفضل.
We have
محمد.
When you say accrual basis of accounting, you include cash and accounts receivable and
cash and non-cash items إذا بدك.
So يعني if there's a transaction that involves partially cash and the remaining is okay, is this what you mean?
Yes. يعني لنقول you had a sale to a client on account. You sold a product to a client on account. Under the cash basis of accounting, you don't take it into consideration. لأنه this does not result in a cash inflow or a cash outflow. Under the accrual basis of accounting, لا, you take it into consideration. لأنه it results in a certain receivable.
يعني these are two different schools ولا؟
إذا two different يعني ليك مثلا on the cash flow statement, we use the cash basis of accounting. On the cash flow statement, we use the cash basis of accounting. ليش؟ لأنه we focus only on cash inflows and cash outflows. When we prepare the income statement, we use the accrual basis of accounting. لأنه revenue, whether it is in cash or on account, we consider it as a revenue. Well, expense, whether it is paid or whether it is on account, we account for it as an expense. So on the cash flow statement, we are mostly using the cash basis of accounting. On the income statement, we are mostly using the accrual basis of accounting.
So when we're preparing a balance sheet, we need to use the accrual.
accrual basis كمان لأنه في عندك receivables في عندك payables and so on and so forth. وضحت محمد ال difference?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. When we want to build a financial statement, the income statement, we use the
accrual basis of accounting. لأنه certain
that includes cash and non-cash.
صح. Revenues and expenses.
But the accrual basis is non-cash. This is what I mean. Accrual basis is non-cash. But
لا.
when we use
It's cash and non.
It incorporates cash and non-cash revenues and expenses. When it comes to the cash basis of accounting, it only includes the cash basis of account, the inflows and the outflows, like the cash flow statement. Sorry, Muhammad. ما في يعني بالprivate sector, the cash basis is only applied when it comes to the cash flow statement. Mostly, they don't use it. Okay. طيب. The first financial statement we'll be looking at is the income statement. Of course, as we said, the income statement provides a certain net amount which could represent either a net profit or a net loss. And as we said, on the income statement, we report the revenues and we report the expenses. And as we said also, when we prepare the income statement, we use the accrual basis of accounting. ليش accrual basis؟ لأنه the revenues may include cash revenues and those revenues on account. And the expenses كمان may include the expenses that were paid in cash and the expenses that were on account. The first item on the income statement is net sales. What do we mean by net sales؟ شو بنقصد بنت sales؟ مش money. شفت كيف؟ مرات بيكون في عنا صحيح. So net sales is equal to the following. Gross sales less مرات بيكون في عنا sales discount مظبوط بنعطيه للزبون ومرات بيكون في عنا شيء اسمه sales returns. So in this case, when we talk about net sales, we are talking mainly about the gross sales of the company, less any sales discount, less any sales return. بتروح تشتري شيرت مثلا ما بتحبه بتيجي على البيت بتقيسه بتطلع فيه هيك you don't like it. شو بترجع بتعمل؟ You go the second day and then you return it. This is what we call, in certain cases they return a certain amount of cash. In other cases بيعطوك coupon that you can use to buy any other items. This is what we call sales returns.
When he gives you a coupon, it means he's crediting your account.
In this case, he is liable. So in this case, yes, he owes you a certain amount. So it's a credit for him, and it's an asset for you from your own perspective. Right. Why do we need to keep track of separate account for sales discount and sales returns? لأنه آخر السنة I would like to know how much of discounts were offered to the clients. This is one. And second, I would like to know how much is our sales policy is effective. لأنه إذا في عندي 60% of the sales have been returned, معناتها there is a problem. The client comes into my store, I give him the wrong product or the product that he does not or she does not need, شو بيرجع بيعمل? The second day he or she comes and return the product. So it's very important to keep track of sales discounts and sales returns in two separate accounts.
This way you cannot see them.
So when we talk, بس هن in their accounting system, in their information system, they should have access to what they call sales returns and sales discount. It should be available. وبيعملوا comparative مرات from one month to another or from one year to another. ليشوفوا progress over time. طيب. So when it comes to net sales, we mean, well, gross sales less any sales discount less any sales return. And of course, when we talk about sales, we are talking mainly about sales revenue. Indirectly, this is a sales revenue. And as we said, this sales revenue includes both cash sales revenue and those sales revenue on account. That results in account receivables. They result in account receivables.
These are gross revenue, right? Sales.
Yes, in this case, هون في عندنا الجروس sales discounted by a certain amount or from which we deduct a certain amount of sales return. Any questions? Type. Next, the second item is an expense, which is the cost of goods. The cost of goods sold. So in this case, this is the cost of the merchandise that we are selling. هلا. In the case of a merchandising company, نحن we buy the product ready-made from the supplier and we sell it to a client. يعني بنكون in this case we are working as a middleman, as an agent. نشتري من السبلاير, we display the product in the showroom and then we sell it to the client without any modification, without any additions or deletions. هذا in the case of a merchandising company. In the case of a manufacturing company, it's not as straightforward. لأنه in this case, we'll be manufacturing that item. So we have to compute the cost of goods sold, we have to compute the cost of material that was used, we have to compute the cost of labor that was used, and then we have to add to it a certain amount of overheads. Okay? For financial accounting, we'll be focusing mainly on merchandising company. بنشتري بالproduct من السبلاير for $2, بنحط profit margin عليه 20%, 30%, and we sell it at 2.5 or 2.6 dollars. We're not going to account for manufacturing companies. Manufacturing companies will be discussed later on in management accounting, which is the second part of accounting. Now,
There's a small section missing.
You
paid to bring the part. You paid to bring the...
في عنا هلا in this case, yes, that's correct. If you buy a certain product, let's say from Germany, بدك تدفع transportation, you add it to the cost of the goods. You pay customs, you have insurance while shipping. This has to be added to the cost of, that's correct.
كثير ايتم السمن ما بخلص.
بدك شو بتدفعوا من جيبتك؟
لا اذا عملنا نحكي فيهم
You would pay them yourself? Hey, مزبوط. So in this case, we're not going to go into the details. We're not going to go, as Wissam is saying, we're not going to go into the details. But if you think about it, the cost of the product that you are selling, it includes the cost of the product itself, plus any additional costs that you incur to bring in that product from the supplier to your warehouse to be ready for use or for sale to the client. ندفع transportation, we have to add it. ندفع insurance while shipping, we have to add it. ندفع customs على البور, كمان we have to add it. نرجع كمان and so on and so forth. All these have to be added to compute franchise مسي. إنه أنت you are let's say buying.
Again, رحت عند التنورين and they told me you have to pay $300,000 لتقدر تشتري هالبضاعة.
This is a fixed investment. It's called a franchise, and this is recorded as a long-term asset on the balance sheet.
It's not included in the
Yeah.
price of
بعدين هيدا the cost of the bottles of water and so on. This is something that you account for it later on. And you're not selling the franchise. You are selling the bottles of water. So the cost of goods sold is related to the cost of the bottles of water that you are selling. But at the same time, you have to account for a certain cost for the franchise. هيدي الفرنشايز أنت أخذها يمكن على 10 سنين. ساعتها if you paid $300,000, so it will cost you $30,000 on a yearly basis. This is in addition to the cost of the bottles of water and so on and so forth. But this is something different, completely different. لا ما له دخل. When you talk about the cost of goods, بتكون عم تحكي على المانيفاكتشرينج cost يلي هني the costs that are related to produce that item in the warehouse or let's say in the factory. Okay? Any additional items that are not related to manufacturing costs, we account for them separately under selling expenses or administrative expenses. فلما عم نحكي على manufacturing company, we include in the cost of goods sold only manufacturing cost. قديش دفعنا حق البطل؟ قديش دفعنا electricity؟ قديش دفعنا fuel generator and so on and so forth. Supervisor, labor and so on and so forth. But we don't include anything that's not related to manufacturing. Now,
allocation of these costs of the product.
في عنا different type of allocation methods كمان رح نحكي عنهم بالmanagement accounting. So for now let's focus our discussion on merchandising companies. يلي هني those companies that buy a product that is ready-made from the supplier, display it in a certain showroom and sell it to their clients. Okay? So in this case, when we talk about the cost of goods sold, this is the cost of the items that were actually sold as per the definition, as per the name. And in this case, it includes, what does it include? The cost of the product itself, plus transportation, plus insurance, plus customs, and so on and so forth. Okay? The difference between net sales and cost of goods sold is the gross profit. But in this case, this is not equivalent to the net profit for a simple reason. Then we have other expenses that we need to cover, including what we call selling expenses and what we call administrative expenses. مرات بيسموهم general selling and administrative expenses, GSA, ومرات بيحطوهم separately selling and administrative. What do we mean by selling expenses? لاحظ sales, salaries, expenses. معناتها هدول salaries for whom? For the sales team. لأنه هدول expenses are directly related to selling. Traveling expenses تبع مين traveling expense؟ كمان تبع sales team. And advertising expenses related to selling our product. Administrative expenses, they are mostly related to the back office, related to administration. Salaries, office and general expenses, في عنا depreciation of the furniture and equipment, property tax expense, rent expense, bad debt expense. شو قصدنا bad debt expense؟
income ما حصلنا.
مش income. receivables. كان في عنا receivables from the client, but those receivables may not be collected in the future. فلس الزبون ما حنقدر نحصل. He left, he migrated to Canada لنقول. So in this case we won't be able to collect. This is what we call bad debt. Later on we'll come to account receivable and accounting for bad debt. بس هون as long as we have it we need to discuss. بعدين في عنا
Shouldn't be under other income and expenses? Why?
لا لأنه هذه it's related to operations. It's related to the activity of the company. Anything that's related to operations we report it here. Anything that's not related to operations we report it at the bottom of the income statement. Okay? في عنا بعدين telephone and internet expense, and then we have insurance expense. Then we have other revenues and expenses. We have a certain amount of interest revenue لأنه في عنا saving account. في عنا a certain amount of interest expense لأنه we have a certain amount of debt. And then we have income tax, and then we have the net profit. So as you can see on the income statement, we have simply a listing of all the revenues, all the expenses, and the difference between the two. And very important, when we prepare the income statement, we are mainly applying the accrual basis of accounting. ليش accrual basis؟ لأنه as we said, some of our revenues are in cash, while others are on account. And some of the expenses were paid in cash, while others they are still recorded or accounted for as a payable. They were not paid, so we still account for them on the income statement. Okay? We only focus on cash inflows and cash outflows under the cash basis of accounting, and this is mainly when preparing the cash flow statement. Yes, Johnny.
The bad debt expense, it's the whole amount يعني هون it shows $1,000. It means $1,000 unpaid receivable. You should
يعني out of the total receivables, that we have, 1,000 are doubtful. They may be not collectible. At this point in time, we are not 100% sure. ليش we are not 100% sure؟ لأنه you don't know which client will end up paying and which client won't. But at this case, you have to take a certain estimate. You have to estimate the amount of bad debt. Yes.
بس السؤال هلا هون كاوديتنج وايز مين بيقول يعني how you define that this is bad لأن هون you are lowering your revenues يعني
ليك شو بيصير؟ مزبوط. أنت when you sell on credit, why do you sell on credit؟ ليش بتبيع لزبونك على حساب؟ to generate more revenues. صح؟ الماتشنج برنسبل شو بيقول؟ لاحظ الماتشنج برنسبل اللي حنا all the time. Matching principle says the following. If you generate more revenues, you have to match a certain expense. What is the expense that's related to selling on credit to your clients? في عندك a certain risk that you are taking which is related to bad debt. فبيقول لك الماتching principle at the end of every year you have to look at your receivables and you have to estimate a certain amount of account receivables that may not be collectible. It's not 100% accurate, but you have to make that estimate. لأنه الماتching principle بيقول لك for every additional amount of revenues or benefits that you generate, you have to match a certain expense. طيب عال, when you sell on credit, you are generating more revenues. You have to match with a certain expense related to bad debt. هيدا amount is not 100% accurate, and this is actually one of the limitations of the financial statements. Many figures that are reported on the financial statements are based on estimates. They are not 100% accurate. نحن لما بنقول انه هيدا البيلدينج will be depreciated over 20 years. طب ما هيدا البيلدينج it may last 30 years. شو عرفنا؟ It will last only 20 years. But at this point in time, based on the information that we have, we expect it to last for 20 years. But this is an estimate. لما بنقول انه في عندنا $1,000 of bad debt, we are not 100% sure. This is based on prior experience. والله في عندنا a certain number of clients that may be doubtful. ليش؟ لأنه يمكن الزلمة بنعرف هلا بالسوق in the market his reputation is not good. وضعه مش مزبوط. So in this case it may be doubtful.
بس الأكاونتس
we cannot wait until we are sure انه ما حيدفع to account for bad debt لانه in this case we'll be violating the matching principle. ما فيك تنطر لبعدين. بيقول لك إذا in this year you generated a certain amount of revenues from credit sales, you have to match an expense this year, even though the expense is based on estimate rather than 100% accurate numbers. ما فيك, you cannot wait until the client, let's say defaulting, and then in this case you account for bad debt. You have to adjust for it, you have to account for it, you have to estimate it at the end of each year or at the end of each accounting periods. يلا.
But you report your full account receivable.
هيدا on the balance sheet. ما دخلني. بعد we did not go to the balance sheet. We are looking at the income statement. On the income statement we report a certain expense related to bad debt. We call it bad debt expense. يلا, we go to Muhammad, then Muhammad. Muhammad, you had something to say.
There are methodological approaches to calculate allowance for bad debt.
هلا بنحكي عنه لأنه في عنا one chapter on account receivable and how to estimate bad debt. رح نحكي عنه. بس كمان هيدول الميثودز as you already know محمد, they are based on estimates. They are based on estimates. نعم محمد.
Two questions.
تفضل.
Regarding bad debts, those debts that are definitely not going to be received.
لا مش definitely.
No, I'm not saying that it's a question.
نعم.
The debts that are definitely not going to be received, like a client that
مات.
bankruptcy.
بعيد الشر.
We'll have another entry. So
ساعتها in this case what do we do
we write
محمد؟
them off.
We write them off.
Okay, and then it's
We write them off. شو يعني we write them off؟ بنشيلهم على البالانس شيت لأنه in this case you have an account receivable, but this account receivable won't be received in this life. You may receive it later on, but in this life you won't receive it. يمكن بنطلع بعدين لفوق بنحاسبه بنلحق بنقول له خيي بعطيها but here you won't be able to receive it. Yes.
the income statement there will have another entry.
لا لأنه أنت already you accounted for an expense before ahead of time.
No, maybe the
Expense was not enough.
yeah. Exactly.
So برجع بزيد expense later on for the difference of what I accounted for before and what I need to account for. بزيد الإكسبنس تبعي.
The second question
نعم.
is regarding the interest, excuse me.
يلا شوي. إيه.
بس خليني أشوفها.
يلا.
Here other income and expense.
نعم.
You have an interest revenue and you have an interest expense.
مرات بياخدوا النت بين الاثنين. مرات they net the two. They get the difference between the two and they put the net amount. In this case, they opted to report the interest revenue. في عندك saving account عم يطلع لك عليه interest. So in this case, you generated a certain amount of revenue, and at the same time, you had a certain debt, and you incurred a certain interest expense on the debt. So you have interest revenues and interest expenses.
Income from operation can be other income. So
إيه.
why do we put
Income from
operations?
إيه. This one يعني
No.
هيدا إيه. شو
لا خلاص.
شو الحال؟ So the interest revenue and the interest expense are mainly related to savings account and a certain amount of debt that you have incurred a certain amount of interest on.
Thank you.
Any questions? علينا محمد. Yes.
No, bad debt, it's a very
يلا وسام.
Do you take provisions for bad debt?
Yes, this is what we were saying يا وسام. انت شو بتعمل؟ بس مش عم تنتبه يا وسام، ما عم تسمع. طيب شوف شو بصير. انت during a certain year you sell on account. صح؟ You sell $1 million on account. بنوصل على اخر السنه you collected $400,000 out of the 1 million. بقي في عندك $600,000 of receivable. تجي at year end تجرد كل هالزبونات هيدول، كل هالreceivables. تعمل a certain segregation or classification of account receivable. ايام ممكن يكون doubtful, which one may be doubtful and which ones are not. The ones that are doubtful, تجي بتقول أنا for this year I'm going to take a certain expense, I'm going to take a certain provision for a certain amount of bad debt based on the analysis that I did. هلا بchapter 3 we'll be going over how to account for account receivable and bad debt in a little bit more details. But normally this is what we do. At the end of the year بنيجي بنقول these are the account receivable that we have. Some of them are doubtful, some of them are not. Doubtful account شو بنعمل؟ بناخذ لهم provision. We take a certain provision, a certain estimate. هلا what will happen in the future ما بنعرف. بس we have to take that provision now. ليش؟ لأنه the matching principle states the following. Since you generated additional revenues from selling on credits, you have to match an expense related to credit sales. The expense that you have to match is called bad debt or uncollectible account expense. We call it bad debt expense or uncollectible account expense.
So if you cashed more than your bad debt provision, بصير عندك extra revenue.
مش extra revenue، بتكون الاستيميت يلي عملتها before is overstated. انت توقعت انه $100,000 يكونوا doubtful, but it turned out انه only $30,000 were doubtful. So in this case the estimate that you did before was overstated. وبتعمل adjustments in the future. كمان نفس الشيء يمكن تقول انت تقول انه $10,000 are doubtful ويطلع عندك $20,000 are doubtful, more than what you expected. ساعتها كمان in the future later on بتعمل a certain adjustment to account for the underestimation or overestimation that you had in the previous year. But you cannot say that I'm not going to estimate bad debt. This is not acceptable لأنه in this case you would be violating the matching principle. لأنه matching principle بيقول لك once you generate more revenues you have to match an expense over the same time period. You cannot defer it for later on. You cannot wait for later on.
Can they be accumulated from one year to another?
صحيح لأنه الأكاونت ريسيفبل اللي ما اندفع هالسنة بدنا نحمله معنا ونروح نطالب فيه زبون the next year.
يعني متى خلص بتقول
ساعتها in this case شو بنعمل يا محمد؟ محمد بيفيدنا بهالموضوع. كيف بنعمل رايت اوف؟ مزبوط بس who decides on whether to write off the account receivables or not؟ بدنا نعمل جمعية عمومية ولا لا؟ وبده يجتمع البورد اوف دايركتورز. The board of directors have to meet and then they decide on whether to write off the account receivables or not. لأنه when you write off what are you doing in this case؟ عم تسامح الزبون ب 100,000 أو 150,000 أو 200,000. Right?
خلص أفلس الشيء.
Why do you write them off? افترض you have a client and this client went bankrupt.
طيب I still keep it يعني.
From where are you going to collect this amount?
I might not collect it at all.
So it has no value. You cannot report it on the balance sheet. Dick, you cannot report an asset on the balance sheet unless this asset is expected to generate economic benefits or is going to generate cash flows. يعني ما في أنا حط account receivable on the balance sheet for $200,000 knowing that the person that owes me this $200,000 died 5 years ago. ما بدي أحصلهم. It has no value. You cannot report that asset on the balance sheet. You have to write it off. How to write it off؟ بدك جمعية عمومية وبدك مجلس إدارة, the board of directors to decide on whether to write off the account receivable or not. Right? لأنه in many cases those amounts are sizable. ما في أنا سامح زبون ب100,000 as accountant. أنا ما لي حق. I don't have the right. Although I will do the journal entry, I will record the debits and the credit, but I cannot do it myself. لازم يكون في جمعية من مين؟ من المساهمين. هن they have to decide whether to write off or not. The board of directors. Okay? Any questions? So this is the income statement for a لاحظ merchandising company. Manufacturing company قصة ثانية بنحكي عنها بالmanagement account. Yes, John.
Also the bad debts provision is should be accounted.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. ايه شو لك كان؟
ما شفنا بس الكريدت بالدبل.
ايه لانه in this case ايه
ليش في شيء على اليمين في شيء على الشمال؟
ماشي these are بس a way of presentation. انه هون عم بيقولوا لك انه these are the expenses and this is the total of all the expenses. These are the individual expenses and this is the total for all the expenses. It's only a method of presentation. ما لانه هيدا ما في total. هيدا you have only one item. ما في عندك several items that should be grouped and reporting and then you report a certain total. بس هون ما في عندنا debit و credit. It's only a certain balance. في عندك ال revenues pluses, ال expenses minuses, and the difference between the two is either a positive amount اللي هو an income or a negative amount اللي هو a certain amount of loss. Any questions؟
نعملهم on the side.
يلا. هلا الديتيلز تبع الديبت والكريدت they don't show on the balance sheet, they don't show on the income statement. بيطلع عنا conclusion اذا بدك summary. The details are available in the accounting system. تفتح الاكاونتنج system في عندك all the debits, all the credits and so on a one by one basis. بس financial statements they don't show all the debits and the credits. They show only a summary of the financial position of the company. Income statement, profits, losses, revenues minus expenses. Balance sheet, assets, liabilities and equity accounts. Where do you get all these figures from? بدك تروح على accounting information system to get all the information and to compile it in a certain way so that you get the financial statements.
An auditor can tell you, please prove that.
جيب لك ما هو هذا الاوديتور بيكون عامل ريفيو. For example, محمد شو كنتوا تعملوا؟ You have 10,000 transactions. You don't audit all the transactions. What do you do in this case? بتاخد sample. Depending on the quality of the controls of the company. كل ما كان في عندك better controls بتقول والله ال numbers are trustful. I can trust them. So in this case you reduce your sample. Reputation of management. Whether management has a good reputation or not. كمان هيدا this is another factor. And expertise of the accounting staff that they have. Can I trust them or not? Prior history. كمان if it is a new client ولا an old client and so on. So several factors are taken into consideration when auditing the financial statements. So to audit those reports and to issue a certain opinion at the end, yes, you have to look at the different journal entries, at the different debits and credits, and then based on that you derive the financial reports. A final note is related to bad debt. As we said, account receivables arise mainly from credit sales. So you generate more revenues. Once you generate more revenues, you are required by the matching principle to match a certain expense. And the expense that you have to match is referred to as bad debt expense or uncollectible account expense.
بس ليه مسمينه debt؟ لأن لك منه debt.
Bad debt لا debt to other مظبوط. Debt of the clients. صحيح.
Just a stupid example.
اللي محمد.
When you say matching, you're not matching the revenue with, it's not an exact matching.
لا أكيد it's not matching. أكيد it's not equivalent. أكيد it's not.
The matching second.
أكيد it's not equivalent لأنه if you are going to match every revenue with an equivalent expense, in this case you won't have any profit.
So why do we say matching?
Matching يعني accounting for the expense for a certain amount of expenses over the same time period. You match by time. You match by time. So you match a certain expense that is related to that revenue that was generated over the same time period. يعني for example, suppose أنت بعت لكلاينت تنقول on January 1st 2011. Okay? At the end of 2011, you knew that the client may not be able to pay. So during 2011, you have to recognize a certain amount of bad debt expense. You cannot defer it for 2012 or 2013 until the client goes bankrupt and default. You cannot do this. So you have to match the expense with the revenue over the same time period. We don't match by magnitude. We match by time frame as a بدك أو time period. This is what we call by matching. This is what we refer to as matching. Another financial statement is the statement of retained earnings. As you can see in this case, we have retained earnings at the beginning, what we started with at the beginning of the year. We add to it whatever net income that was realized during the year, and then we deduct whatever amount of dividends that was distributed to get the retained earnings at the end of the year. Any questions about the statement of retained earnings? طيب. Next, we have the balance sheet. On the balance sheet, we have a listing of assets, a listing of liabilities, and a listing of equity accounts. As you can see, under IFRS or International Financial Reporting Standards, we start with the non-current assets. بينما in US GAAP we start with the current assets. هوني, what type of non-current assets do we have? شو يعني non-current assets? What do we mean by non-current assets? Long-term assets. And as you can see, the balance sheet is prepared at a certain specific point in time. In this case, the end of December. What type of non-current assets do we have? يعني furniture and equipment. But those furniture and equipment have been depreciated. This is why we deduct what we call accumulated depreciation. Do you remember what type of account is this? تذكروا شو سميناه؟ شو سميناه؟ contra asset account, accumulated depreciation. ليش contra asset account؟ لأنه it should be deducted from the asset on the balance sheet. So accumulated depreciation is a contra asset account. It's a certain account that is deducted from the assets on the balance sheet. This is why we call it a contra asset account. It has a credit balance, مظبوط, لأنه the assets have a debit balance. To be opposite to the asset, it should have a credit balance.
What are the rules for it?
في عنا one chapter on depreciation. في عنا different methods of depreciation. في عنا straight line method, equal depreciation over time. في عنا declining balance depreciation methods, high depreciation at the beginning and low depreciation at the end. وفي عنا another depreciation method which is based on the units of activity or units of output. مثل مثلا, for example, depreciation methods that are used for, let's say, photocopy machine. As you make more copies, depreciation should be higher. And this is why we have, in certain cases, we install counters. لنشوف كم copy عملنا على هال photocopy machine. In this case, yes. لأنه in this case, the asset will be fully depreciated. So when it comes to depreciation, we have two accounts that are relevant to depreciation. We have the expense on the income statement. We call it depreciation expense. وفي عنا accumulated depreciation on the balance sheet, which is the contra asset account. ليش بنسميه contra asset account؟ لأنه it should be deducted from the assets on the balance sheet. It's a minus on the balance sheet. This is why they report furniture and equipment less accumulated depreciation.
Accumulated is from the beginning of the period?
From the time you started using the asset until the present date. It could be accumulated for the past 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, depending on the life of the asset and when did you start using that asset. This is why we call it accumulated. It has been accumulated over time. Yes.
When
John.
the depreciation period is over, we still put it in the accumulated depreciation or خلاص?
هلا in this case إذا خلصت depreciation, if the asset was fully depreciated, then in this case the asset would have a net book value of zero. يعني بصير في عندك لنقول in this case 67,000 for furniture and equipment less 67,000 when it comes to accumulated depreciation. So the difference between the two would have a carrying value of zero. Normally accountants won't let this let's say this stage to be reached. شو بيعملوا in this case? Before reaching the end of the useful life of the asset, إذا كان بعض الأسset still useful, شو بيعملوا؟ بيعملوا revision of estimates. Revision of estimates. أنت شو بتكون قايل؟ This asset is useful for 10 years. طيب بنوصل على year 9 بعد في عنا بس 1 year. But we notice that the asset is still in good conditions. So what we do in this case, بنقول the depreciation of the asset should not be 10 years, it should be 15 years. So بنعمل extension for an additional 5 years. And whatever amount left at the end of year 9, we don't depreciate it for 1 year, we split it over 6 years. So before we reach that stage, شو بنعمل؟ بنعمل something called revision in estimates. We revise the estimated useful life of the asset. بنقول نحن at that point in time لما اشترينا الاسset, we thought that it would be useful for 10 years, but now based on the current condition of the asset, it may be useful for an additional 5 years. So whatever amount that is not depreciated at the end of year 9, we depreciate it over 6 years rather than 1 year. محمد.
Or you reevaluate the price of the asset.
In this case مزبوط فيك تعمل revaluation للاسset. That's correct.
Evaluation means that we have to
Report it at its fair market value.
مثلا بناي يعني انا 200,000 اشتريتها وهلا حتى مليون انت بعدك عم تحط 200,000
كيف تدخل بالانكم ستيتمنت؟
لا بس 1 minute.
But in this case بصير في عندك a certain revaluation gain. But in this problem we have a certain issue. And once you report it,
The historical cost.
once you report it لحظة هلا بنجي على historical cost. Once you report it at its fair market value, you have to keep on reporting it later on at its fair market value. You cannot go back to the historical. You cannot go back to the historical
Why
cost.
not remove the depreciation?
شو remove
إذا
it?
السنة اللي بعدها the phone costed me at face value $1,000 less depreciation by December 31 $200. ليه السنة اللي بعدها عم تحطوا 800؟
لا usually شو بتعمل؟
ليه برجع بحط accumulated؟ يعني مثلكم 1000 برجع بشيل
ايه normally لانه في عندك historical cost principle. For the historical cost principle, it states the following. You have to report the cost of the asset on the balance sheet and you have to show whatever amount of accumulated depreciation. يعني in your case, I would have to show, let's say, telecom equipment for $1,000 less accumulated depreciation of 200, and I will show a net of 800. Next year, 1,000 less 400, and so on and so forth. Why do I need to keep this 1,000? ما في يقول I cannot report it as 800, 600, 400 and so on. This is not acceptable. لأنه the historical cost principle tells you the following. You have to keep on reporting this asset at cost. طب كيف بنفرجي? How do we show إنه this asset was depreciated? We use this contra asset account اللي هو accumulated depreciation. So in this case, by doing so, we keep on recording the asset at cost. We respect the historical cost principle, and at the same time, we demonstrate that the asset has been depreciated over a certain period of time by deducting a certain amount of accumulated depreciation.
But going back to the question.
Fine,
Going back to
Wissam?
Muhammad.
Now,
In case the value Ali.
we have the option to keep the asset at cost or to report it at its fair market value. But the fair market value is not available for all assets. This is one of the problems with dealing with fair market value. أنا لما بقول the cost of this apartment is $200,000, I have an objective evidence إنه I paid $200,000 to acquire the apartment. طيب, the same apartment, all of us, we go and visit the apartment, and before leaving, we take a piece of paper and a pen, and we write a certain value for that apartment. What is the probability in all of us would reach somehow comparable figures? 0. It's very minimal. I would pay a little bit more, ليش؟ لأنه it's close to A U B. It's very convenient for me, right? Somebody else who may not like to be stuck in the traffic and so on, they would say, well, it's much less than this. Okay? So in this case, when it comes to fair market value, you may not have an objective measure of fair market value. In the case of the apartment, in the case of a building, لأنه different valuators or different, let's say, real estate agents are going to end up with different figures. Which one do we report? The lowest, the highest, the average? What do you do in this case? In the case of, let's say, shares that are listed on the stock market, we don't have any problem with fair market value. Then stock prices are available on a daily basis. And this is supposed to be an objective measure of value. So we report those shares that are listed on the stock market at their fair market value.
بس ما عم تكون 100% accurate it's total equity.
مش 100% accurate. You have to be careful when it comes, you have to go back. What is the purpose behind reporting financial statements? Providing information that's useful for investors and creditors for decision-making purposes. I'm not preparing the financial statements for you to know the fair market value of the assets or the fair market value of the liabilities. This is not the objective of preparing the financial statements. إذا بدك تعمل valuation للcompany, إذا بدك تعمل valuation, this is another objective, and you have to have another task. بدك تجيب حدا يعمل لك evaluation of the company, and this is completely different from financial reporting. This is completely different from preparing financial statements. Preparing financial statements follows a certain set of standards. We call them financial reporting standards. هيدول standards, they may not necessarily be useful for valuation purposes. Okay? So in this case, you need to transform, you need to change the financial statements if the objective is different. And when I prepare financial statements, I follow financial reporting standards, and I prepare financial statements according to those standards. إذا بدك financial statements to be useful for valuation purposes, بدك تعمل several adjustments. $200,000 for the apartment is not good enough. I have to report it at 1 million. لأنه I'm interested more in the fair market value of the apartment rather than the cost of the apartment. Samir.
My question is concerning what Mohammed mentioned, the re-evaluating.
Yes, you can do this. صحيح.
Yeah. بالbalance sheet, how do you put it? لأنه the balance sheet are already balanced between the equities والliabilities and the assets. طب if the asset أنت already عملت لها re-evaluation كانت 200,000 مثلا you made it 800,000. بصير في عندك a certain unrealized. شوف شو بصير في عندك. بس شوف شو بصير في عندك. بصير في عندك a certain unrealized gain. وهيدا unrealized gain is related to the revaluation of fixed assets, and this is reported under the equity section of the balance sheet. يعني بتزيد لنقول $600,000 on the asset side, وبتزيد $600,000 under the equity side of the balance sheet, which is related to what we call unrealized holding gains or unrealized holding loss. Yes. Exactly this يعني a person can mess up يعني بالbalance sheet.
This is one يعني يا سامر أنت صبتها مظبوط. This is one of the major criticism of fair value accounting. يعني هلا بيقولوا طيب عال, if you want to report assets at fair value, there is lots of subjectivism when it comes to determining fair value, and this will open a door for people to abuse fair value reporting by recording certain gains and by recording mainly certain gains. Losses ما بنعتل همهم. Who would like to record losses? People are more inclined to record gains that are somehow inflated on their balance sheet by reporting higher values for the assets.
How can you control it in this case?
This is why fair value accounting is used for a specific set of assets. مثل ما حكينا, إذا في عندك shares that are listed on the stock market, shares listed gold مثلا, إذا في عندك active market for a certain asset, then in this case you can apply fair value accounting. In other cases you cannot unless you have an objective measure of value. شو الobjective measure? طيب, what was the price of Solidaire shares at the end of December of last year? All you have to do is to go to the stock market, look at the closing price for the share at that specific date, and all of us in this case would reach the same conclusion. Nobody can challenge that fact. So in this case, yes, you can use fair value accounting.
My question, second question,
No.
when you say if you want to report capital gains, like
No.
if you re-evaluate and
No.
زدت بالاسset, you have to increase the also
بالequity. No.
Don't you need to have like a board meeting to increase them ولا
In this case, yes, this is a decision that has to be taken by the shareholders. لأنه as we said, it has significant implications. It has significant implications. لأنه لما بتعمل evaluation, you will be taxed on whatever capital gains that you are recognizing. That's correct. That's correct. And you have to be careful. And once you report an asset at fair market value, you cannot go back to cost. خلاص.
I'm asking this because I remember during my work in Saudi Arabia,
Hey.
we had something like 15 tower cranes that we re-evaluated them. They had a value of 1 and we had to re-evaluate them because of many reasons. One of them is getting facilities from the bank.
صحيح. And in this case, this would improve the balance sheet.
Yes, we faced the issue انه نحن we evaluated them and our assets يعني طلعت كثير بس we didn't know how to put them in the equities لأنه we faced the issues of taxation والزكاة.
لا وعندك depreciation is very important.
بعدين.
When you evaluate, you get hit on the depreciation very quickly.
بالضبط.
ليش؟ لأنه depreciation is going to be based on شو؟ on the revised value of the asset. يعني بدل ما أكون عم بعمل depreciation for an apartment that had a cost of $200,000, I'll be depreciating a certain amount of $1 million. So in this case, it would have significant implication on the amount of depreciation that would be reported on the income statement. So normally, when it comes to such assets, unless you are really in need of reevaluating those assets, the current practice is to keep them at cost. Now,
On the other side,
وين هيدا؟
مثل ما صار بدبي نزل خبط السعر من $1,000,000 الشقة مثلا
لأنه in this case the fair market value was inflated, was overestimated. هلا هذا this is something different. But normally this is one of the major criticism. This is one of the major criticism of fair value accounting. إنه the fair value of certain assets cannot be determined objectively. So in this case, many people will abuse this option, okay, by introducing subjectivity into fair value accounting. And this is one of the major criticism. But at the same time, many people would say, well, أنا في عندي crane, the book value هو $1, بينما قيمته اليوم بالمارket is $1 million. Do I keep it at $1? ما بتزبط. If I go to the bank, the balance sheet, the strengths of the company, the financial position of the company would be completely different. So in this case, I have to have this option. So whenever we have access to what we call an objective measure of fair value, then in this case, well, fair value accounting could be applied. Okay? Sorry, George, you had...
term what we use sometimes economic life of an asset.
Real useful life, I think.
Okay.
Or the life through which we expect the asset to generate economic benefits. Now.
Okay, with the way we define it in our company, it's for certain assets, then when we sign contracts, just for cable system, certain cables sometimes are taken out of life, what the economy, the revenues are less than what it takes to maintain them. So there's no more anymore an incentive for us, all the customers to invest in these assets.
هذا بالتليكوم.
So we define it as 10 years, for example, initially. بس عم بتصير اوقات انه they extend it لانه after 10 years they realize that no, the asset is still working.
بيعملوا revisional estimate in this case. They revise the estimates.
So it's the same as what
it's similar in concept. Yes, it's similar in concept. But normally, at a certain point in time, you may need to revalue or you may need to revise your estimates. To revise your estimates at a certain point in time, either upward or downward. It depends.
Okay. When they do due diligence on companies, let's say they want to acquire a company, due diligence, they sometimes question the useful life of assets. That sometimes.
Well, in this case, yes, they may question it.
They might say, no, this asset we don't consider it.
No, this is one of the basic purposes of due diligence, to review the accounts and make sure that the accounts do somehow reflect the financial position of the company. مظبوط. They may be criticized. صحيح.
And بس هيك final one بس on the assignment كأنا شيء on the valuation of a company. Was it correct to take assets minus liabilities?
Correct. Correct, but no, this is not actually the true value of the company. But one rough estimate of value is the net asset value, اللي هو the difference between the assets and the liabilities. الإكويتي. صحيح.
When we do valuation business case, ناخد cash flow over مثلا 10 years.
This is another method of valuation. Actually, when it comes to valuation, you have different methods. The first one is to get the difference between the fair value of the assets and the fair value of the liabilities. هيدا اسمه asset based approach or balance sheet approach إذا بدك. Another approach إنه I'm not interested in the assets and the liabilities of the company. I'm mostly interested in the cash flows that the company is able to generate. So in this case, I forecast future cash flows and I discount them to the present. This is called discounted cash flow models. وفي عندنا كمان other methods of valuation مثلا مثل multiples. We look at comparable firms and we apply certain multiples. So we have different methods of valuation. You will get back, I think, to valuation later on in finance courses.
Or when another company acquires another company, بياخد غير value of the share بالmarket, the market cap of the company. أكيد بيدفع عليها premium.
If the company is traded, ساعتها the company is already priced by the market. في عندك the price per share, it's well known.
In some industries, the assets are purchased from suppliers, which with prices that are varying by the list price of those suppliers. And I'm referring to cranes or forklift systems. Each year, you know, that piece of equipment is worth how much if you want to buy it now from the supplier. In that case, there is no longer a fair price. It's the market price. We talk now about market price for that asset, and we take out the depreciation as a percentage of the current market share.
يعني شو بيصير الماركت برايس normally you cannot tell it until you sell the assets. يعني مرات انت you estimate انه والله the value of the asset is $100,000 but you may not be able to sell it for $100,000 actually. You may be able to sell it for 80 or 90. ما بعرف, I don't know. So when it comes to depreciation and accounting for fixed assets, unless you have an objective measure of value, then in this case you refrain from using fair value accounting. لأنه it will be criticized as we're discussing over the past maybe 5 to 10 minutes.
It is listed in the list price of the supplier.
بس هيدا for the new one. انت الكرين صار عندك 5 سنين. شو بعرفني what's the value of the crane after being used for 5 years?
Out of the total lifespan of 10 years is 50%.
ما فيك تحسبها هيك.
So إذا أنا باخذ 50% out from the current value of.
ما فيك تحسبها هيك. Imagine buying a car from a car dealership. رحت اشتريت اليوم سيارة جاكوار مثلا من الشركة. اشتريتها بقد ايه؟ ب 120,000 150,000 ما بعرف قد ايه, right? And in this case you just walk out of the dealership and after 1 month you needed cash. صح؟ If you think about depreciation, the car has almost zero depreciation. ليش؟ لأنه used it for only one month. But if you want to sell it, you cannot say I'm going to sell it by a certain price which is equal to the price that was paid to acquire the car minus 1 month of depreciation. Automatically, you would lose around 20 to 25% of the value of the car. Right? So in this case, this approach إنه والله باخد أنا the value of the crane today استعملته 5 سنين so it has half of that amount as a value today. This is not applicable. This is not applicable.
50% of the cost you booked. It is 50% of the cost you booked.
In this case, you could say this is the net book value of the asset. On our books, this is the value of the crane. But whether the market value is more, less, or equal, this is something different. Type. So we have بعدين the difference between the cost of the furniture and equipment and the accumulated depreciation. We call it the net book. We call it the net book value. يلي هو the value of this asset on the balance sheet or on the books, which is equal in this case to 48,300. So the difference between the cost of the asset and the accumulated depreciation, we call it net book value. بعدين في عنا current assets, في عنا inventory items يلي هو stock, في عنا prepaid insurance and prepaid rent. These are amounts that were paid in advance. These were amounts that were paid in advance. And these are part of the current. لاحظوا, it's a little bit confusing. Prepaid rent, شو حاطين كمان؟ expense. طب ما هي الاكسبنس it should be reported on the income statement. ليش حاطينها على البالانس شيت هون؟ لأنه as we said those prepayments are considered to be part of assets. Once they are consumed, they become part of the expenses on the income statement. يعني if I paid rent of 3 months in advance بيكون في عندي let's say prepaid rent of $3,000. As time passes, $1,000 for the first month will be recorded as an expense on the income statement, and I reduce prepaid rent by $1,000. If I use the apartment for another month, I have another expense for $1,000, and I reduce the prepayment by $1,000. I use the apartment for another month, so I have a total expense of $3,000 and a total prepayment of $0. So as time passes, those prepaid accounts are going to be converted into expenses on the income statement. So in this case, well, it's a little bit confusing. I prefer to call it prepaid rent only. بلا ما نحط expense. Okay, so I prefer to call it prepaid rent. We call it prepaid rent. We call it prepaid insurance. And by now, you should know that prepaid rent and prepaid insurance and any other type of prepayment, these are examples of current assets. Current assets. As they get consumed, the prepayment شو بيصير فيها? It goes down, and the expense on the income statement it goes up. John.
For the insurance, for example,
No.
I made a policy insurance, but sometimes we don't pay it on the spot.
ما فرقاني معي.
How do we register it?
ما فرقاني معي. In this case بيكون في عنا ايه بس بهالحالة you still have an asset. We call it insurance policy or insurance. You don't call it prepayment, and it was not paid in advance. And you credit a certain payable or a certain liability, accounts payable. You don't credit cash. Okay?
الانشورنس بوليسي
As an expense, as an asset.
بالبريميوم تبعها بالبريميوم تبعها يعني
ايه بالامount that was charged. ما انت بس once you buy the insurance policy, they would send you a certain invoice, and this would be the cost or the premium for the insurance that was charged إذا بدك. بهالحالة مش paid. نعم.
and we register it in the balance sheet, the insurance
ايه as an asset.
on the balance sheet.
ايه as an asset. Whether this asset is paid for or not, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. You will pay it later on. But in this case, you cannot call it a prepaid insurance إذا بدك لأنه it was not paid in advance.
But where have we shown that the insurance policy as an asset other
هون.
than the prepaid?
هون.
Other than the prepaid.
لك كمان إذا بدك هلا if you want to be technically شو اسمه, you can still call it prepaid insurance لأنه it has to be paid later on in advance. Whether you paid after 1 week or 2 weeks, it does not make any difference. The concept of prepayment is the following. And you are buying an asset ahead of time, but this asset will last or will benefit you over a period of time in the future. You're not consuming the assets within this month, within this week, or 10 days. It would last for more than 1 month. This is mainly the concept of prepayments.
But this is the case of almost all assets.
لا كيف مثلا؟ افترض تنقول ايه هيدا this is something else. This is a long-term asset. لنقول you purchased A4 paper supplies and all the supplies were consumed during the same month. ساعتها in this case ما في عندك شيء اسمه prepayments.
تشتري فان.
Van, in this case, this is a long-term asset. You depreciate it over time. Okay? Well, these are long-term assets. They are useful for a relatively long period of time.
One last question
Yeah.
concerning the depreciation, but it was a little bit bewildering. For example, for the van, it is depreciated over 7 years or 5 years. I don't know.
قد ايه بنعمل depreciation كمان للترانسبورتيشن equipment؟ transportation equipment.
Van, 6 years, 4 years.
4 to 7 I think, or 4 to 8.
Fine, fair enough. Year 8 هلا خلص صار بطل عنده صار بالبلد تبعته زيرو, but you are still consuming it.
So in this case, you should not reach that stage. As an accountant, if you think that the asset will be useful for more than 8 years, you should not wait until the end of year 8 to reach a net book value of 0. And at the end of year 7, بيجي بقول والله the asset is in good condition. It may be useful for another 3 years. So whatever is left at the end of year 7 instead of depreciating for one more year اللي هو year number 8, I would depreciate it for 3 more years اللي هن 8, 9 and 10.
And what happens if we didn't do so and we're still using it? We
هلا
cannot
normally you
register it as an asset ساعتها.
هلا you report it as an asset, but this asset has a net book value of 0. It has a net book value of 0. بلا.
اذا بعته از بروفيت بتبيعه لحالك.
Difference between the selling price and the net book value is okay.
انا خطبت مكتب الفان على فكره.
Yeah.
صار ليجل فيك تبيعه بدولار.
يلا. It's taped. يلا منيح. طيب. So in this case we should not reach that stage whereby we have a net book value of an asset which is equal to 0. لازم نعمل قبل ما نوصل للستيج هيدا نعمل re-estimate revision للestimate of the useful life and to spread whatever amount that was not depreciated to depreciate it over the newly estimated period of time or useful life. طيب بعدين في عندنا account receivable, interest receivable, and then we have the allowance for doubtful accounts اللي هو the allowance for bad debt. And as we said, the allowance for doubtful account is كمان a contra asset account. It is deducted from account receivable on the balance sheet. أنا في عندي $10,000 of receivable بس 2,000 are doubtful. So the net amount that I should be able to collect is 10 minus 2, which is 8,000. So in this case, I show the gross amount, I deduct the allowance, and then I get the net amount that I could realize. We call it the net, net realizable value. شو يعني net realizable value? It's equal to the gross account receivable minus the allowance for doubtful. We call it the allowance for doubtful accounts. So the allowance for doubtful account is another contra asset account. What was the first contra asset account that we discussed? Do you remember? Accumulated depreciation. And both of them are deducted from the asset on the balance sheet. هلا هون way of presentation ما عم بحطوهم between parentheses بس هون they are looking at ليك هون شو حاطين less. It's a preference the way you present a certain report حسب كل واحد عنده لا ما في normally كل واحد عنده a different way of presentation. طيب when it comes to the equity side of the balance sheet we have a certain amount of share capital ordinary يعني common shares. They have $5 par value. شو قصدنا بالpar value? What do we mean by par value? Par value is the nominal value at the time the shares were issued. يمكن اليوم market value يمكن يكون $50 ما بنعرف. Okay? How many shares were issued? 10,000. And outstanding. شو قصدنا ب-outstanding? They are held by investors. By parties outside the company. We call it shares outstanding. We call them
held by the partners.
كمان outstanding. They are not held by the company. Remember, the partners own the company, but the company and the partners are completely separate entities. Do you remember the separate entity assumption? They own the company, but they are not the same. لأن the company may decide to buy back some of its shares. And in this case, the company would own those shares that are repurchased. مش partners. So the partners and the company are completely separate entities. Yes. وفي عنا هون a certain amount of retained earnings or retained profits. Yes, بشرى. أنت هلكتيني بشرى بالأسئلة اليوم يا مان. هلكتيني بالأسئلة اليوم. يلا.
So the ordinary the shareholders and the outstanding are people outside the company.
لا. The ordinary is the type of shares. لأنه as you know in certain cases ممكن يكون في عنا common which is the regular or ordinary class of shares. ممكن يكون في عنا what we call preferred الأسهم التفضيلية. Normally in the case of companies you may have shares that are common and shares that are preferred. All companies should have a common class of shares. يعني ما فيك تعمل شركة بدون ما يكون في عندك a common class or ordinary class of shares. In certain companies, they may have what they call a preferred class of shares.
شو الفرق بين الشير ستوكس والجي دي ار global
والله exactly I don't know the exact difference between the two بس في issues related to يمكن voting power. GDRs ما عندهم global depository. When it comes to GDRs we call them GDRs. هيدول global depository receipts. هيدول these are issued I think by Bank Audi and they are listed, they are traded on the London Stock Exchange and I think they are traded in the US. والله I don't know. But for London I think one يمكن لأنه they are traded outside on foreign stock market. Two يمكن ما عندهم voting power. They don't have any voting power. وما بعرف هيدول إذا equity ولا debt. I don't know whether they are equity instruments or debt instruments. إذا بدكم we can investigate for next time and discuss. بس ADRs مظبوط. So I don't know whether they are debt or equity instruments. I have to check. ما بعرف. I don't know the exact detail of this financial instruments.
In fact,
بعودي bank.
You can buy stocks and you can switch them to GDR.
Okay, in this case they are convertible. We say they are convertible. And sometimes the preferred stock may be convertible into common stock. Anytime you can convert it into a common stock. But one issue is the following. In all companies, they should have a common class of shares. Some companies, they have common plus preferred. Like in the case, I think Blom Bank, في عندهم أسهم تفضيلية. في عندهم a preferred class of shares. ومرات بيكون في عندهم more than one preferred stock. Preferred class A, preferred class B, preferred class C. Equity. في عندنا later on, we have one section on related to the equity section of the balance sheet. إيه. We'll talk. إيه. نحكي عنها a little bit more details. Outstanding يعني they are held by parties other than the company itself. يعني they are held by investors, they are held by the partners and so on and so forth.
If they are held by the company, where do you put them?
We call them يلا. In some cases, a company may buy back some of the shares that were previously issued. In this case, we have what we call them هيدولي shares previously issued and reacquired. يعني Solidare, for example, issued a certain number of shares. رجعوا they purchased back some of the shares that were issued previously. هيدول shares that were repurchased, we call them treasury stock. So we have company A buying back its own shares. يعني مش في عندنا انه والله عودي bank buying shares in Citibank او عودي shares buying shares in Microsoft and so on and so forth. هيدول ما بنقول لهم treasury shares. Hey, we are talking about هيدول investments. We are talking mainly about Audi Bank buying some of the shares that were issued before. Solidare كمان نفس الشيء. Microsoft the same. Those shares we call them treasury shares. They are reported under the equity section of the balance sheet as a minus, as a negative amount. ليش؟ لأنه in this case you are reducing your capital. You are buying back some of the capital. Think about it. What will happen when you issue new shares? شو بصير بالcapital? طيب. In this case, what are we doing? We are doing the opposite. We are buying back some of the shares. So in this case, we are reducing the capital.
So far صار عندنا common shares, preferred shares, ordinary shares, outstanding treasury.
الcommon shares هن الordinary. This is one. Okay. بس إذا بدك لأنه it's a minus. إيه إذا بدك. بس when it comes to shares, we may have more than one class of shares. We could have common and preferred. Done? طيب.
Why would the company buy back?
هلا بقول لك يلا. هلا. يلا. This is one of the most important reasons. They may think that the shares are undervalued. The share value is 20, it's trading on the stock market for 15. So what do we do in this case? We buy them at a discount. طيب. When it comes to the shares, we have a certain number of shares that we are authorized to issue. شو يعني we are authorized to issue? يعني in this case we may, let's say, be authorized to issue هدي 50,000 shares. شو يعني? This is the maximum number of shares that we can issue. This is the maximum number of shares that we can issue. For now, up until this period, we have a certain number of shares that is issued, and in this case, let's say it is 10,000 shares. What does it mean? We still have 40,000 shares that can be issued, to be issued later on. Whether we issue those shares or not, this is something different. This is not our discussion. This is not our worry. لأنه in case we need cash, we may sell a certain number of shares. If not, then nobody would force us to issue the remaining 40,000. هيدول 10,000 shares that were issued, they could be outstanding. شو يعني outstanding? They are held by parties other than the company. What does it mean in this case?
Treasury zero.
It means that the company did not buy back any of the shares that were issued previously. So in this case, the outstanding shares are 10,000, they are held by parties other than the company, and the treasury stock in this case is zero. طيب, what if we as a company, we purchased back 1,000 shares? What will happen in this case to the shares that are outstanding in this case? They are not 10,000 anymore, they will be only 9,900 shares. ليش؟ لأنه 1,000 or in this case it's 9,000. لأنه in this case نحن actually we issued 10,000, but one out of the 10,000 were repurchased by the company. So they are now held by the company itself as part of the treasury shares. And we have the remaining 9,000. هيدول شو بنقول لهم؟ Outstanding. ليش outstanding؟ لأنه they are held by parties other than the company itself. By the way, treasury shares are not entitled to vote. لأنه مين بده يقرر لمين بدهم يصوتوا؟ They cannot vote. They are not entitled to receive dividends. لأنه the company cannot distribute dividends to itself. Yes.
They have a nominal value, let's say $10.
At cost.
Come back at $50.
At 50.
Okay, $40.
We record them at cost.
At $10?
Yeah, لا at 50. أنت قد دفعت. You debit treasury stock for 50 and you credit cash for 50 and that's it.
Oh, okay.
Once you reissue them later on, ساعتها you account for the issuance price and any difference is accounted for as a gain. We call it additional paid in capital. نحكي عنها بعدين بس نحكي عن الاكويتي. But not as in the equity, the cost that was paid. The cost that was paid. Yes. نعم محمد.
In this case, those shares in the treasury shares are theoretically equivalent to those shares that were authorized to issue but were not issued.
لا مش بالضرورة.
Theoretically يعني I mean they are shares that have they don't receive dividends.
لا ايه بس في شغلة هون. This share is not similar to this one. لأنه this one has been issued and reacquired while this one has not been issued. They are not the same. ايه.
Yeah, I mean theoretically.
صح.
In
صحيح.
effectively. But these were repurchased. So are their value once you want to sell them? Now, if you're in a position you want to sell some of these treasury shares and some of the shares that were issued but not sold, or authorized but not issued, would they be sold at the same value?
They are shares for the same company,
which is the same,
and they are completely similar, and they would be issued at the same value اللي هو الفير ماركت value اللي هو at share price at the time of issuance.
But why you don't distribute dividends?
لأنه in this case وزعنا dividends. Who's going to get the dividends on the 1,000 shares? مين بده ياخذهم؟ ما هيدي. These are owned by the company itself. These are owned by the company itself. So in this case شو بنعمل؟ بنوزع retained earnings. Usually we reduce retained earnings. وين بنحطهم؟ They would stay in the same account اللي هو retained earnings. So كل شيء بنعمله عم نشيل من هالجيبة وعم نحط بهالجيبة. Yes, they are the same. Correct.
When the company decides to distribute dividends, let's say $100,000, they divide it over 9,000.
Yes, correct. حتى الكورم تبعك بالشير هولدرز ميتينج it's not based on 10,000 shares anymore. It will be based on 9,000. وقت اللي بتقول 50% من المساهمين لازم يكونوا موجودين it's 4,500 votes. It's not 5,000 anymore. نعم جو.
لما بتقول authorized shares to be issued هيدا upon establishing the company.
هيدا when you establish the company بتقول أنا عم establishing a corporation. The corporation has a capital of let's say $5 million and this capital is fully paid. حدفع كل الكابيتال and in this case the company should be authorized to issue a certain number of shares.
optional يعني أنا بقول بدي 30,000 بدي 50,000.
It depends on the capital of the company and it depends on the par value. It depends on the relationship between the capital and the par value.
This relation is also يعني influenced by the number of shares. يعني أنا بقول I want my account to be 30,000 or 50 or whatever and I will divide the capital with the number of shares.
إذا في عندك capital 5 million والpar value 5 معناتها you are authorized to issue a maximum number of shares which is equal to 1 million.
بس البار فاليو
nominal. انت بتقرر قد ايه بدك البار فاليو. It's a nominal amount but normally it's said to be equal to the value of the share at the time of issuance.
يعني البار فاليو is
مرات بحطوها 10 cents مرات ايه.
is a result from the number of shares that I want to have.
لا مش بالضرورة. البار value could be related. It could be something nominal. تحط انت اي value بدك اياها. أو it could be related to the value of the stock at the time of issuance. Okay. So إذا بدك the par value is a nominal value that is established, that's set at the time of incorporation. لما بتعمل establishment of the company.
Who sets this authorized value, authorized number?
في عنا شي محامي؟ ما في عنا ولا محامي هون؟ We don't have a lawyer؟
في عنا جوز محامي.
معقول؟
شو بيساوي؟
مين؟ مرتك محامية؟ طب استشرنا اياها بالموضوع هيدا. كوربوريت بتشتغل؟ اوف. طب خلص بلاها على طيب. Any questions? يلا let's continue the balance sheet and then we have a break ولا أي ساعة البريك؟ ربع؟ طيب. يلا 5 minutes. And then we have the non-current liabilities يلي هن the liabilities that are long-term in nature. في عنا bonds payable that are due on June 30th of the year 2018 يعني بعد تقريبا 7 سنين. Right? And then we have the current liabilities في عنا notes payable, accounts payable, property tax payable اللي هي ضريبة الأملاك المبنية that was not paid to the government. في عنا income taxes payable and then we have the totals and of course the total of the assets have to match with the total of the liabilities and the total of the equity accounts. نعم.
The bonds payable due هالقد بعد 7 سنين هون including the interest
لا in this case this is the face value of the bond. This is the face value of the bond. كل ما بندفع do you know what we mean by a bond payable? A bond payable is a debt instrument نتدين نحن and the bond has to pay a certain amount of interest at fixed time intervals. كل ما ندفع interest we debit interest expense and we credit cash and that's it. So in this case this is the value of of the bond itself, or this is the face value of the bond. Interest is accounted for as time passes and as we make the payments of interest over time. We debit an interest expense and we credit a certain amount of cash, and that's it. So interest is accounted for separately from the bonds, from the face value of the bonds. Any questions? Questions? Accrual basis and cash basis, as we said, the cash basis. Yes. يلا تفضل. يلا خلينا نرجع على البالانس شيت. ايه ما في مشكل. You could borrow for 5 months or you could borrow for 5 years or 10 years. شو المشكلة؟ ايه. مرات بيكون في عندنا mortgage note payable. بيكون في عندك رهن على apartment أو على عقار. We call it mortgage note payable. ومرات بتكون a note payable personal إذا بدك. ما بيكون في أي collateral. ما بيكون في أي ضمانة. We call it a regular note payable. But in both cases, notes payable would assume or would result in a certain amount of interest. Any questions? Questions? شو؟ يلا. We have.
It's not like a loan.
شو هو؟
رهن. لا. It's a security.
الرهن بلا collateral. أنت بتتدين, you borrow and you pledge a certain collateral against the amount of money that you borrowed. صحيح. In this case we call it a mortgage note payable. ليش mortgage؟ لأنه في عندك رهن على عقار. It could be an apartment, it could be a building, it could be a piece of land. ومرات بتتدين on a personal basis. بتقول لي يا عمي أنا salary تبعي $15,000. I can borrow up to 1/3 times a certain multiple. صح؟ So in this case we can borrow based on your own income or your own revenue without pledging, بدون ما ترهن الابارتمنت أو اللاند أو البيلدينج.
An asset if it is mortgaged. How do you record an asset if it is mortgaged?
You record an asset if you are buying an apartment and you credit, you record a certain liability. As time passes, you will repay the liability, you will repay the interest on the liability, and you have a reduction in cash. لأنه you are making cash payments.
إيه بس إذا depreciation اللي عم تحطها أنت على الأسد الطريقة إنه صار يمكن الأسد بعد depreciation أقل من الجارنتي.
ما دخلني أنا. الجارنتي is something different. ليه؟ The asset is recorded at costs. The market value of the asset may go up and down, but depreciation is based on the cost of the asset at which it was recorded. Okay? So, when it comes to depreciation, it's independent of the market value of the assets. Questions? Questions? Yeah. Let's have a break for 15 minutes until 11:30 and then we get back. نحن normally we have to end at أي ساعة لازم نخلص؟ 12:30 واحدة.
معنا نهار كله مع
لا بس هلا قبل الظهر.
يا 12:30
I think. طيب. We have a faculty meeting at 12:30 with the new dean. So I have to leave at around 20 past 12. 12 وثلث 12 ونص إلا 5 I have to run. ما في I cannot. يلا. Let's keep. لا. Let's keep. يمكن let's have a break for 5 to 10 minutes. 5 to 10 minutes and then we get back. So we get back at 12:30. Cash versus accrual basis. And we said when it comes to the cash basis of accounting, we actually focus on cash inflows and cash outflows. While under the accrual basis of accounting, the scope is a little bit broader. We take into consideration any revenues that are on account and any expenses that were not actually paid in cash. Okay? And the cash basis of accounting is primarily used when we prepare the cash flow statement. This is the only instance where we use the cash basis of accounting. And here they are saying that the cash basis financial statements are not in conformity with IFRS or International Financial Reporting Standards. حتى they are not in conformity with US GAAP, US Financial Reporting Standards. They can only be used in the case of the preparation of the cash flow statement. هون عطينا a very simple example to compare the cash basis versus the accrual basis. Let's have a look at what they are saying in this case. So we have a contractor that signs an agreement to construct a garage for $22,000. In January, the construction began and we incurred a cost of $18,000 on credit, and by the end of January we finished the contract. In February, we collect $22,000 cash from the customer, and in March we paid the $18,000. Okay? In this case, we are preparing the income statement of the company on the cash basis. In January, we should not have any revenues, we should not have any expenses. ليش؟ لأنه we did not collect any cash from the client and we did not pay any cash, correct? In February, we collected the $22,000 from the client. So in this case, we'll have a certain amount of cash receipts of $22,000. And in this case, the total cash receipts for the 3 months is equal to $22,000. صح؟ But what about the cash payments? We did not pay anything until March. So in this case, when it comes to the cash payments, we have a zero cash payment for January, we have zero cash payment for February, and we have 18,000 cash payment for March. So in this case, if you think about it, using the cash basis, we have zero profit, or we have no losses for the month of January. We have $22,000 of profit for February, and we have an $18,000 of loss for March, and the total in this case for the 3 months is a net profit of $4,000. In this case, we have these, as you can see, the figures are a little bit strange. ليش؟ لأنه in this case we are using the cash basis of accounting. So we are focusing only on cash inflows and cash outflows. Let's prepare the income statement under the accrual basis. Under the accrual basis, once I render the service or once I sell the product, I have to recognize a certain revenue. Whether I received cash or not, this is completely irrelevant. The same for the expenses and the payments. So in this case, if you think about it, once you sign the contract and you start working on the contract, then in this case you recognize the revenue, whether you received it in cash or not. If you received it in cash, then your cash balance should increase. If you did not receive it in cash, then you should have an account receivable. Yes?
In the case of signing the contract, doesn't mean that you're invoiced. You may have signed the contract,
but in this case, شو عملوا لنا? In January, quality construction began, and we by the end of January, لاحظ, by the end of January you delivered a finished garage to the buyer. So in this case, all the contract have been completed in January. هلا, if you finished, let's say 50% of the contract in January and 50% of the contract in February, so what do you do in this case? You split this revenue 11 and 11. Okay? But what about the expenses? What about the expenses? How much expenses did we incur in January? In January, 18,000. So we have to recognize an expense of 18,000 in January. Even though, when did we pay it? We paid this amount in March. So as you can see in this case, cash flows are not necessarily important under the accrual basis. We look, when did we render the service? When did we sell the product? And we recognize the revenue. And we match a certain amount of expenses over the same time period. Yes, Samir.
Samir, this one it's more realistic.
ليش more realistic?
Because it defines exactly what happened.
لأنه in this case we are not only looking at cash flows, we are not only looking at cash inflows and cash outflows. Under the cash basis of accounting, we were mostly interested in when are we receiving cash and when are we paying or dispensing cash. So in this case, we were looking at only cash inflows and cash outflows. In this case, we are looking at when did we realize the revenue, when did we render the service, when did we sell the product, and when did we incur the expense, irrespective of whether we received cash from the client or not, irrespective of whether we paid for the expense or not. This is what we call the accrual basis of accounting. And as we said, when we prepare financial statements, we use the accrual basis of accounting, except in the cash flow statement, where we use the cash basis of accounting. For a simple reason, the cash flow statement, by definition, it focuses on cash inflows and cash outflows.
Your bank is probably could be more interested in your cash flow.
If you are borrowing over the short run, then most likely the bank would be interested in the liquidity position of the company, how liquid the company is. قد ايه في عندك cash, قد ايه في عندك receivables. If you are borrowing over the long run, most likely the bank would be interested in your capital assets, in your fixed assets. شو عندك أرض, شو عندك building, شو عندك let's say شو بعرفني apartments and so on and so forth. So it depends on the maturity date of the loan. Is it short term or long term? Any questions? Questions? Type. So in this case, they are saying that the cash basis has a certain problem or has a certain weakness, and it does not take into consideration the credit facilities and anything related to credit, whether it is related to revenues or whether it is related to expenses. Questions? Questions? Type. But as we said, cash by itself is important. Then it helps us maintain the liquidity of the company. And this is why we have one financial statement, which is the cash flow statement, which is focused properly or solely on cash and cash flows. And this is the cash flow. This is the cash flow statement. Well, when it comes to the cash flow statement, we have three different activities on the cash flow statement that are reported. We have cash flows from operating, cash flows from investing, and cash flows from financing activities. When we talk about operating activities, we are mainly talking about transactions with the clients, whether we are selling to the client or whether we are providing services to the clients, or any other related activities, such as, for example, payment of salaries, payment of rent, purchase of insurance policy, purchase of goods from suppliers, and so on. But in this case, we'll be focusing only on inflows and outflows. How much cash did we receive from the client? How much cash did we pay to the suppliers? How much cash did we pay to the employees? How much cash was paid for rent? How much cash was paid for insurance? How much cash was paid for taxes? So we focus only on cash inflows and cash outflows related to the operations of the entity. When it comes to investing activities, we are mainly looking at investments in long-term assets. Long-term assets. Purchasing a building, purchasing a piece of land, purchasing an equipment, purchasing a certain number of shares in Audi Bank, or Citibank, or Microsoft. All these are examples of investing activities. The sale of a certain building, the sale of a certain equipment. It's not necessary that we are always buying. صح? In many cases, we may sell certain assets that we own. When it comes to financing activities, we are mainly talking about debt and equity, borrowing and debt repayment, issuing shares or buying back shares, and distributing dividends to the shareholders. Hamad?
لما تشتري مثلا machinery related to your core operation, it's investing.
It's investing, yes. In this case, you are investing a certain amount related to a long-term asset or a long-term investments.
Because if you purchase something that is of value but not related to your core operation.
مثل شو مثلا؟
يعني مثلا نقول أنا luxurious building اشتريت paintings حطهم على الحيط.
But still, in this case, it's part of investing. Still part of investing. But there is one thing that is different. If you are buying, let's say, inventory items. يعني أنت عم تبيع cranes. Cranes are long-term assets. But in this case, you are not buying this long-term asset to use it in operations. On the contrary, you are buying this long-term assets to sell it later on to your clients. This is part of operating activities. Okay? طيب. So when it comes to operating activities, we may have, well, cash inflows from the sale of goods or services to the clients. Cash inflows or outflows from returns on loans and on equity securities. إذا كان في عنا مثلا, let's say, investments in other companies, we may receive a certain amount of dividends. Okay? And we may have certain cash outflows related to purchase of inventory, purchase of services from employees, from government, from the lenders, and from others for expenses. Now,
the return on loans, even though if it was not our core business.
Return on loans, yes. Like return on loans, يعني في عنا هون interest. What they mean by return on loans, we are talking about interest, revenue. وفي عندنا كمان return on equity securities اللي هو dividends. هيدول those two, although they may be investing in nature and financing in nature, or mostly investing in nature, we still report them in the operating section of the cash flow statement for a simple reason. لأنه when it comes to the operating section of the cash flow statement, we have two approaches. We have the direct method and the indirect method. Under the indirect method, those two amounts are reported as part of net income. لأن they are reported on the income statement. هيدول اثنيناتهم revenues. صح؟ And net income is accounted for in the operating section. So to be consistent between the direct method and the indirect method, those type of revenues are left in the operating section of the cash flow statement. مع انه they may be investing in nature or financing in nature. Okay? So in this case, يعني, this is actually a detail that you may not want to stop at, but it's only a matter of consistency between the direct method and the indirect method.
Eventually, the result is the same, whether we put them all in one.
The result is the same, it's only a matter of classification, operating versus investing or
But the fact this
finance.
is an inflow, it means I'm getting a return.
Correct.
From the loan I did.
Correct.
I lended money to.
Correct.
مش إنه أنا
صحيح. صحيح. No, in this case, it's you are lending others, or you are having a certain savings account, and this saving account is generating a certain amount of revenue in the form of interest. Okay? But this is actually a detail, and as we said in this case, we are mainly interested in conformity between the direct method and the indirect method. So we do not need to stop at these details at this point in time. When it comes to investing activities, as we said, we may have certain inflows and outflows related to the sale of property, plant, and equipment, related to the issuance of debt and equity, sale of debt and equity securities of other entities, and collection of principals on loans. And the opposite is true. So mainly, we have investments or sale of long-term assets, or we have investments in the debt and security, equity securities of other companies. When it comes to financing, we are talking mainly about debt and equity of our own company. Issuance of shares, buying back some shares, borrowing and debt, repayment, and so on and so forth. In addition to the payment of dividends. Any questions about the cash flow statement? So we have three different sections on the cash flow statement: operating, investing, and financing. All of them focus on cash inflows and cash outflows. Now, this is the basic purpose of the cash flow statement. But the cash inflows and the cash outflows vary from one section to another. The operating section includes those inflows and outflows that are directly related to the operations of the company. Okay? When it comes to the investing section, we have cash inflows and outflows related to investments in long-term assets or investments in debt and equity securities issued by other companies. When it comes to the financing section, we are looking mainly at borrowing and debt repayment. We are looking at issuance of shares of our company and repurchase of shares of our company and the payment of dividends to our shareholders. Any questions? Questions? As we said, when it comes to the operating section of the cash flow statement, we may have two methods to prepare it, the direct and the indirect. And in this case, this is a potential format of the cash flow statement. هلا بنشوف الcash flow statement for a company that operates in the UAE. Any questions about financial statements? Financial statements. Type. To recap our discussion for today, let's go over the financial statements of UFC company. Hey, you should have
Practice material.
يمكن it should be at the end of.
You can practice material.
لا مش part of practice material. لا. We should have it by the end يمكن. It's not at the end.
بلا في
لازم يكون في couple of financial. لا this is supplementary material. لا بركي at the end.
مش هذا
آخر شيء.
ممكن البراكتس ماتيريال معقول؟
لا مش at the end of practice material. خلينا نشوف. حطيت هون. I'll send it to you by email. يمكن you know what? يمكن she left them as a separate print out. هلا I'll ask رولا. هلا بشوف. Okay? Anyway, this annual report is available online. Anyone can access it and it's available online for free. You don't have to pay for it. Okay? I can send it to you by email if you want. Hey, it's a listed company in the UAE. And in this case, just for demonstration purposes, we are going to go over the financial statements of that company. Now that we refreshed when it comes to the income statement, to the balance sheet, statement of retained earnings, and the statement of cash flow, I think it's time to recap, just to be able to summarize what we did over the past couple of hours. Of course, this company has disclosed the income statement, and this is for the year ended December 31st of the year 2011. So this is the income statement for one full year. We have, of course, the revenues, the sales revenue, and then we have the cost of sales. In case you would like to know more about the cost of sales, all you have to do is to go to footnote number 5. Then when it comes to financial statements, you cannot understand fully the financial statements without going to the notes to the financial statements. ومثل ما بتلاحظوا, this report is around 33 pages. نحن في عنا 5 or 6 pages of financial statements, and the remaining 26 pages, what do they include? Footnotes, supporting documents, and explanations of the different items that are reported in the financial statements. So you cannot understand the financial statements without actually going over the notes to the financial statements. As you can see, many items are associated with specific notes in the annual report. هلا بنشوف. We'll go to some of them and we discuss. We have the revenues, and then we have the cost of sale or the cost of goods sold, and then we have the difference between the two, which is the gross profit. Then we have now هلا بنشوف شو اللي نزل الجروس بروفيت. For a simple reason, لأنه لاحظ the increase in revenue has been matched by a larger increase in cost of sales. هلا بنشوف why. We may have a reason. Then we have administrative and general expenses. We have compensation for agency termination. In this case, they may have terminated an agency for one of their dealers, and they had to pay him or her a certain compensation. The foul around 15 million dirhams. They had selling and distribution expenses. They have finance expenses and others, and at the end, they have a certain amount of profit. As you can see, profit has decreased by around $34 million dirhams. But in this case, 15 out of the 34 million is explained by the termination of the agency. So this is something that we expect to recur in next year ولا لا؟ Most likely it won't occur later on. So this is something only temporary. This is something that's only a special event that may occur once every 5 or 10 unless it is something recurrent. ساعتها in this case this should not be troublesome. ليش؟ لأنه next year this effect won't be reported on the income statement and it won't affect our bottom line. Okay? At the end they have this measure which is very important and you should have heard about it. Earnings per share, or sometimes they refer to it as EPS. What do you mean by EPS? What do you mean by earnings per share?
How much money they're gonna give the shareholders?
Number of shares.
George?
The profit divided by
Yes.
the number of shares.
If we would like to distribute all the profit for this year to our shareholders, how much each one is entitled to receive? And in this case, we are talking mainly about shares that are issued and outstanding. Treasury shares are not included in the computation of EPS or earnings per share.
شو الفرق بينه وبين dividends؟
يمكن أنا يكون عندي earnings 0.84 وزع بس 0.2 in the form of dividends and retain the remaining 0.64. So there is a difference between EPS and إذا بدنا DPS, dividends per share. أنا يمكن يكون في عندي $1 of profit بس يمكن ما وزعها كلها. I may distribute only 20 cents and the remaining 80 cents would be retained by the company. So in this case, what we are saying is the following. If we wanted to distribute all the profits for the current year, then in this case we should be able to distribute at the 0.84 dirhams per share. Questions? Sam.
يمكن يكون اوقات الديفيدنز اعلى من الايرنينج.
ايه لانه يمكن in this case يكون في عندنا profit from previous years that were accumulated. So we are distributing the profits of the current year and some of the profits from previous years. شو فرقني معي؟ أنا إذا كان في عندي profit this year 1 million وكان في عندي profit accumulated from previous years 10 million. So I can distribute a total of قد ايه؟ 11 million. يلي هو 1 million from this year and 10 million from previous years. صحيح. ايه كلود.
احنا لما عم نعمل statement وعم نشوف اليرز قبل كمان نعمل compare.
بلا بس هون when we compute earnings per share this is only for the current year. But what Samir is asking is the following. طب can I distribute more than $0.84 in the form of dividends? Yes. لأنه in addition to this amount of profit, I may have accumulated other amount of profits from previous years. When we نشوف هيدي على retained earnings on the balance sheet.
So in this case, the dividend per share is larger than the earnings per share.
إيه؟
So in this case,
If this happens, then the dividends per share would be greater than earnings per share. Correct.
بس
نعم.
نحكي عن الاي بي اس
نعم.
outstanding.
نعم.
يعني you take the profit and you divide the number of shares.
By the number of shares issued and
regardless if the company owns them or not.
issued and outstanding. The companies, the shares that are issued by the company بنسميهم treasury shares. ما بنسميهم outstanding. So we focus only on the shares that were issued and outstanding. So any treasury share is not included in the computation of EPS. طيب في عندنا وعد one term اللي هو موجود هون it's called basic and شو الفرق بين البيزك and diluted? What do you mean by basic and diluted? In certain cases بيكون في عنا some financial instruments that are convertible into common stock. Like in the case of preferred stock. You can convert it anytime you want into 5 common shares. مرات بيكون في عنا debt بنقول له convertible debt. It's convertible into a certain number of common shares. The question now is the following. What if the preferred stock were converted into common stock? What is the convertible debt was converted into common stock? قد ايه بتصير earnings per share? This is what we call the diluted earnings per share. In this case, the basic and the diluted are the same, 0.84. What does it mean? ما في عنا convertible preferred stock وما في عندنا convertible debt لأنه the number of common shares that is existing now is going to be the same ما حيتغير. Okay? بيكون في عندك البيزك 0.86 diluted 0.64. Okay?
But diluted, they assume that all option related.
In this case, they would assume any financial instrument that may result in a change in common stock number or common shares number is actually exercised, is actually converted.
يعني someone needs money from me بقول له خد فيهم shares.
لا مش someone needs money. شوف شو عم بيقول. أنا شو عم لك شو عم بقول. عم بقول مرات بيكون في عنا convertible debt. مرات بيكون في عندك convertible preferred stock.
سؤال هنا confirmed debt.
اي مين بيقرر؟ مش انت بتقول له convert your debt into common stock. هو the holder. هو the holder of the debt بيقرر انه it's better for him or her to hold stock rather than debt. So in this case he or she may decide to convert the debt into common shares.
بيقول لك أول سنة.
But لا anytime. But the conversion factor is already set ahead of time when he purchased this convertible debt. The same for the preferred stock. Sometimes preferred stock can be convertible. طيب, what will happen يلا? What will happen to EPS in case, by the way, this is theoretical. لما بنقول diluted earnings per share, this is 100% theoretical. What will happen to my earnings per share in case all the convertible preferred stock, all the convertible debt were actually converted into true common stock? شو بصير بال EPS? It's highly hypothetical. It's fully hypothetical. In this case, it does not mean that the shares were actually converted. It does not mean that the debt was actually converted. It's only a hypothetical question. What would be the earnings per share in case all these instruments were converted into common stock? Okay? So it is a hypothetical question if you want. It is a what if scenario. What will happen to EPS if all these financial instruments were actually converted into common stock? بيكون في عندنا basic earnings per share, then we'll get a certain EPS, we call it diluted earnings per share. Yes, Muhammad.
That was actually my question.
Hey.
So in this case, a convertible debt, once it is transferred, it no longer exists. It is.
We assume. شو بيصير?
No. Once it's exercised, once the holder of convertible debt exercises the right and transfers it into common share, then
it does not exist.
It won't exist anymore. And the diluted, it's like a provision that we have. It's like an assumption that we put in case people want to exercise. So if they are exercised, the earning per share will be lower than one.
In this case, you are telling the reader basically the following. Under the current condition, EPS is $0.84, but you have to be careful. لأنه في عنا other instruments that may be convertible to common stock, and we don't have any control whatsoever over the conversion. هن the holder of the preferred stock and the holder of the debt are the people, or control the conversion of preferred debt and the debt and the preferred stock into common stock.
When does the conversion occur?
لما بتكون more profitable لإلك تحمل common shares versus preferred shares.
This is your decision, but when are you allowed?
Anytime you can exercise. Anytime you can exercise, لأنه this option is available at the time you borrow the preferred stock. At the time you purchase the preferred stock, you buy the preferred stock and you know that it is convertible into, let's say, 5 common shares. You can exercise that option anytime you.
So once an income statement is issued, I'm a holder of if I have convertible debt.
Okay.
I can go to the company and say, well, I want to convert it to.
ما في مشكلة. You can exercise that option anytime you want. It is exercisable anytime you want at a certain pre-specified at a certain pre-specified rate or pre-specified factor. يعني أنت لما بتشتري ال preferred stock بيقولوا لك this preferred stock is convertible into 5 common stock. You can do it, you can exercise that anytime you want. It's an option that you can exercise anytime you want. This is why what we are saying إنه diluted earnings per share is a hypothetical case that the company does not have any control over it. ما في عندك control لأنه it's not in. They do not hold the preferred stock that are convertible, and they do not hold the convertible debt.
If there is a diluted, if there are convertible debts or convertible preferred stock, then there will be another earning per share diluted.
Yes, بيصير في عندك.
So here basically what I'm saying is that earning per share basic and diluted, and it's basic. When you have basic and diluted all combined, then there's no diluted.
صح.
So why do they put undiluted?
EPS basic and diluted are the same.
When there's no diluted, so it means that.
Why do they mention it?
Why do they mention it?
And in this case, إذا بتحط basic, the reader would say, طيب what about the diluted? Would it be the same ولا لا؟ What اللي بتحط EPS basic and diluted, the reader automatically knows that the basic and the diluted are the same. خليني بس أقول بالك. Let me download. إن شاء الله ما تاخذ وقت كثير. Let me download إذا بدكم the annual report, let's say for Procter and Gamble. لأنه Procter and Gamble there is a difference between the basic and the diluted. 1 second. It will take 2 minutes.
In principle, all preferred stock don't have earnings.
بلا كيف لكن؟ بلا كيف ما عندهم earnings.
So the dilution effect is only when such a convertible stock, if it is not converted, it has no earnings. Otherwise, the dilution will have no effect.
كمل لك. The dilution is not, in this case, the dilution is not a fact that happened. It's a hypothetical conditions. What if the preferred stock has been converted? What if the convertible debt has been converted into common stock? What will happen to EPS? But it does not mean that it actually happened. It does not mean that this is the truth. This is what happened.
And usually in dilution, you put this scenario when
all the preferred stock, all the convertible debt. Yes.
You don't
yes.
have different scenarios.
Correct. طلع على EPS. لاحظ هون. This is the annual report for Procter and Gamble, and this is the income statement for the company. And as you can see in this case, a daily basic earnings per share in this case, 3.82. Do you see it? What about the diluted earnings per share? It's around 3.66. So you have a dilution factor of around 16 cents per share. ليش في عندك الديلوشن فاكتور؟ ليش في عندنا dilution factor؟ خليني نشوف لك وين النوتس. Let me see the notes and then we can discuss it for a little bit of time. إيه؟ لأنه notes لاحظ هون في عندك effect of dilutive securities. بيقول لك في عندك conversion of preferred stock حيزيد لك عدد الكومن شيرز by 123.9 million shares. Exercise of stock options and other unvested equity awards is going to increase the number of common shares by 66. So العدد يلي استعملته بالبيزك هو 2.7 billion. حيصير قد ايه؟ حيصير around 2.9 billion. So what would happen in this case to EPS? It's going to decrease لأنه the denominator is going to increase from 2.7 billion to 2.9 billion. ليش؟ What's the reason? لأنه في عندي convertible preferred stock وفي عندي other securities that may be convertible into common shares. What will happen in case that occurs? In this case, the number of common shares is going to increase from 2.7 to 2.9 billion, and EPS is going to change from 3.8 to 3.6.
Because the 123.966 are all the possible.
This is the maximum. What will happen if all the preferred stock is converted into common stock? As you can see, it's a hypothetical questions, and this is only to show the investors, no, the worst EPS that you could reach is $3.66 per share.
But my question was,
نعم.
طالما حطينا the conversion of preferred shares as affecting the dilution, يعني in principle, if they did not convert them, they would not have any earning on those 123.9.
لا, in this case, لا, you will be saving. يعني the way you computed is you computed in the following way. وقت اللي بتقول بطل في عنده preferred share anymore، صار بياخد الايرنينج تبع مين؟ تبع الكومن ستوك. واللي عنده debt شوف شو صار. برجع بقول لك this is 100% hypothetical. What you assume is the following. إذا في عندك حدا حامل debt, he is entitled to receive interest, right? ولا لا؟ طيب. If he converted his debt into stock, هالinterest I'm not going to pay it as a company, I'm going to save it. So my net income is going to change. And at the same time, the number of common shares that are outstanding is going to change. The same for the preferred stock. When you assume that the preferred stock are going to be convertible, يعني أنت as a preferred stockholder, you are not entitled to receive anything anymore, لأنه there is nothing called preferred stock anymore. You will receive anything that the common stockholder would receive. لأنه what is the assumption that you are making in this case? أنت عم تعطيني ال preferred stock، شو عم بعطيك محلها؟ common stock. يعني كل شيء entitlements and benefits related to the preferred stock you are not entitled to receive anymore. The same for debt. تعطيني الdebt securities اللي عندك إياهم and you get a certain number of common shares. So you are not entitled to receive interest anymore. So in this case you are right. Your net income would change by a certain factor and the number of common shares in the denominator كمان is going to change. What would be the ultimate effect? In this case it's a dilutive effect. ليش؟ لأنه in this case EPS has decreased from 3.84 to 3.66.
شو محل بالريبورت بيننا شو الفرق بين البريفيرد والكومن؟
بدك تروح على بتتذكر DEF 14A. Do you remember DEF 14A? You go to that report and you look at the type of shares that the company has and what are the attributes of each type of shares. But DEF 14A اللي هو the proxy circular or the proxy statement, it should provide you with such information. Now, questions? Questions? Right. Let's go back to UFC. Any questions about these? Any questions about the income statement? Let's go and look at one of the notes. Let's say تنقول selling and distribution بدك cost of sales. طيب let's look at 5 and 8. خلينا نطلع على 5 وال 8. This is 3, this is 3, this is 3. بعدنا كمان. This is 5. How do they determine the cost of sales or the cost of goods sold? في عنا, as you can see, this is a manufacturing company. This is a manufacturing company. They take into consideration the cost of material and the cost of overheads. They included in the computation of the cost of cost of sales or cost of goods sold. Okay, and they show you the breakdown by category.
Much more material than last year compared to the ratio.
Okay.
Prorating with the production.
Okay.
It means that next year the opening stock will be much higher.
In this case, they will have around 354,000 or 354 million dollars of yes.
What the opening stock of raw material نحن عم نشتغل طبعا على الديتس لأن هيدي إلا على
Yes. End of the year. This is at the end of the year. Now.
وشو الكلوزنج ستوك of raw material؟
The ending material that was left at the end of the year. يعني شوف شو صار. أنت you started. شوف شو صار. طول بالك. أنت عم تقول I started the year having 1 pen. I started the year having 1 pen. During the year I purchased 2 more pens. في عنا واحد تاني؟ ما في واحد تاني. During the year I purchased 2 additional pens. So I have 3 available. If 1 is left at the end of the year, what does it mean? I consume 2. And this is what they are saying. They are saying, this is the beginning stock This is the beginning stock. This is how much we purchased. And this is how much we are left with. So in this case, this is how much we consumed. صح? This is how much we started with. 1 pen. We purchased 2, and we are left with only 2. What does it mean? We consumed 2 pens during our... We are left with 2, then we consumed 1 in this case. مظبوط.
We consumed them all.
Eh? We consumed?
Minus 96 صار عندنا closing.
لا, this is the closing. This is what was left. This is what was left.
We had 66.
بلشنا ب 66 million.
All what's left تستعمله لبعدين.
هي بلشنا ب 66. How much we purchased? 385. جينا باخر السنه the closing balance قد ايه كان 96. What does it mean? 96 were left.
بيروحوا بالاسد.
We'll be using them later on. Yes, they will be reported on the balance sheet as part of inventory items on the balance sheet.
30 مليون يعني زاد 30 مليون بس.
بده يزيد 90 مليون.
كانوا 66 صاروا 96.
So change مظبوط. In this case is 30 million. صحيح.
يزيدوا عندك بالاسد.
They purchased at a higher price for 150 million.
ما فهمت.
They used to purchase at 232. Now they are purchasing at 385.
ايه بس يمكن they purchased a different quantity. مش ضروري نفس ال quantity they purchased.
بيعوا بضاعة أكثر.
شفت
You
كيف؟
have to look at it from 354 versus 241 is 50% more material consumed.
ايه بس in this case
Can we go back to the revenue?
ايه بس in this case ليك لاحظ. In this case the amount of goods purchased does not have to be the same. اللي يمكن اشتروا أكثر material. This is why the cost was different.
Actual consumption هي 354 versus 240.
If you look هيدول اللي بتطلع عليهم in percentage term أكثر من dollar values.
50% more. 50% more. بينما قديش بيع؟
قديش زاد ال
مش 50%. عنده مشكلة.
This is why you had a decrease in profits. Okay. طيب هذه footnote number 5. Let's go over footnote number 8.
When you say that those remaining raw material, you said you will
يلا لحظة. شو؟
remaining raw material, you said you will account them in inventory. Inventory in the assets. What about the finished goods that are not sold?
كمان لأنه if you think about it.
So the inventory has two parts.
If you think about it, when it comes to manufacturing companies, you may have different type of inventory items. Raw material, work in process, and finished goods. هيدي الماتيريال اللي عندك إياها هون هي it's only raw material. It's only raw material. إيه وسام sorry. قل لي.
بلشنا بطفل سنة بهاد.
شو كان البداية؟ بشو بلشنا؟
بلشنا بالكاش. لا. رجعنا فتنا صرنا عم نحكي شيرز
لا ما هو. We were only explaining this concept لأنه مرق معنا على الانكم statement. شو الديفرنس between the basic and the diluted. فتحنا هيك small parenthesis إذا بدك صغير بس لنشرح شو الفرق بين البيزك وبين الدايلوتد.
باخذ السكر.
EPS ليك EPS as a concept is very important to both accounting and finance. إذا بعدين بتشوف ال valuation of shares, the valuation of stocks, it's a function of EPS. And this term may be very recurrent in any business news that you may listen to. حيلا business news, business لنقول شو اسمه program and so on, Bloomberg and so on. كل شوي بيقولوا لك كل شوي بيقولوا لك EPS and this company released its EPS for the year and so on or for the quarter. So in this case it's a very common technical term that's used in accounting and finance. So it's very interesting بس to know what do we mean by EPS and what does it represent. That's it. Okay? Questions? يلا. Sorry. Let's move to the balance sheet. On the balance sheet, as you can see, we have the non-current assets. Then we have the current assets. We have inventory. We have trade receivables and so on. And under the equity section of the balance sheet, في عندنا الكابيتال. In addition to this في عنا what we call reserve. لاحظ كم reserve في عندهم. What do we mean by reserves? And cushions إذا بدك they set aside وفي منهم مرات بيكونوا required. لاحظ هيدول الاثنين قد ايه التوتال تبعهم these two 25 مليون which is equivalent to the amount of share capital of the company. So most likely they are requested by law to retain a certain amount of profit in the form of reserve until they reach a certain amount which is equal to to the share capital of the company. لأنه in this case بيعملوا security بيعملوا more cushion for the investors and the creditors. لا نعرف بدنا نروح نقرا الفوت نوتس 21 22 23 and 20. اوكي اذا بدك بنروح بنفتحهم هول. طيب شو هني؟ انه مثل اذا بدك احتياط. ما هي كوشن يعني هذه شو بتعمل؟ security. It's security, it's protection. اوكي؟
لما زاد البنك بوروينج
شو صار؟ شو زاد؟
بنك بوروينج صار 46.
كمان لنشوف شو صار in this case we have to go and look at note number 18. طب look at property plant and equipment. شو صار بالproperty plant and equipment in this case؟ لا ما اشترينا property plant and equipment. Look at inventory items. زادوا from 94 to around 113 million. So تقريبا they increased by around 20 million. Okay? Almost 20 million dirhams. Okay? طيب. Finally, we go to the cash flow statement. As we said, when it comes to the cash flow statement, we have three different sections: operating, investing, and financing. If you look, for example, at the investing section, we have purchase of property, plant, and equipment. How much did we pay in cash? Around 6.7 million. We also sold some equipment, and we received a certain amount of cash, which is equal to $193 million. So as we said, when it comes to the investing section of the cash flow statement, we are mainly looking at the purchase or sale of long-term investments, long-term assets, and those are mainly purchases or sale that resulted in cash inflows or cash outflows. When it comes to financing activities, what did we say? Borrowing, debt repayment, issuance of shares, repurchase of shares, and distribution of dividends. خلينا نلاحظ هون short-term loan repaid during the year. So in this case, we are repaying a certain amount. It's a negative cash flow. Certain expenses that were paid and the dividends that was distributed. لاحظ قديش دفعوا dividends in the year. They paid around 17.5 million dirhams in the form of dividends. And this was paid ولا this was declared هيدا هوني؟ This is the amount that was paid لأنه we're looking at the cash flow statement. So they actually dispersed $17.5 million in cash. Yeah. Yeah. شو بدك؟ Financing?
كان minus 38 السنة اللي قبلها minus 38 million net cash.
In this case, net cash from financing can minus 38 صار plus
which means
12 in this case.
in English عملوا investment.
صار في عندهم هذا net movement interest receipt. As you can see, they received around 37 million dollars from the trusts. هلا شو قصدهم ما بعرف. I don't know.
كانوا عاملين investment وأخذوا
ما بعرف يمكن بدنا نشوف ما حاطين هون details.
لما يكون financial activity راح من negative ل positive.
In this case يمكن يكون عم تعمل more borrowing. So في عندك more cash flowing into the company. Or you are issuing more shares. Yeah, you pay the lower amount of dividends. In this case, this is not true. لأنه we paid much more dividends. أكثر به around $10 million. هيدي trust receipt ما حاطين footnote لحتى نعرف شو قصتها. So in this case, when it comes to our discussion of today, now, الoperating يا محمد it's a little bit tricky لأنه في عندك موضوع direct versus indirect. وفي عندك موضوع الادجستمنتس. هلا I don't know how relevant the preparation of the operating section of the cash flow statement is for our discussion. لأنه إذا بدنا نمرق على operating section how to prepare it, we need around one session اللي هي around 4 to 5 hours. And I don't know how relevant this is when it comes to executives like you. ما بعرف. Operating section. So this is why I shy away from discussing the operating section. بتركها I don't discuss it. بتركها على جنب. I discuss only the investing and the financing لأنه they are straightforward and relatively short. ما بياخدوا كتير وقت. Okay? طيب. So in this case for today we refreshed a little bit when it comes to analyzing transactions. We talked about increases, decreases and so on. حكينا شوي كمان how to convert increases, decreases into debits and credits. حكينا شوي على journal entries. How do we record the debits and the credits? قلنا في عنا specific accounts that are debited and other accounts that are credited. And we said that the total of the debit should be normally equal to the total of the credits. وحكينا كمان we reviewed a little bit the financial statements. We talked a little bit about the income statement. حكينا على revenues, حكينا على expenses, حكينا على EPS, earnings per share. We talked a little bit about the balance sheet, the different type of accounts that are reported on the balance sheet. حكينا على contra asset account including accumulated depreciation. حكينا كمان على allowance for doubtful accounts. حكينا شوي على equity section of the balance sheet, number of shares issued, number of shares outstanding, treasury shares, retained earnings and so on. We talked a little bit about the statement of retained earnings and then we closed on the statement of cash flows, whereby we said that the cash flow statement focuses on cash inflows and cash outflows related to operating, investing and financing activities. And we described the type of inflows and outflows that are reported in each section. Any questions? Type. For tomorrow we'll be starting our discussion with account receivable and how to account for bad debt. نرجع بعدين بنحكي على depreciation of long-term assets. How do we depreciate long-term assets? نرجع بنحكي شوي على equity section of the balance sheet and a little bit on the liability section of the balance sheet. 8 الصبح 8 ونص كمان 8 الصبح.
نحن بقى فول داي معك؟
لا كمان نص داي كمان هاف داي. السبت هاف داي كمان و you have full day I think السبت مبلا عندكم هيدا السبت فل مبلا. لا يا رجل